Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity drifts just beneath the surface and science moves slowly enough to let your thoughts unwind. Tonight's story begins not under the stars, but under the waves, in a world so ancient that even time itself might hesitate before diving in. It's a place where the continents were still deciding where to sit, where forests were young and strange, and where the ocean, the vast, breathing cradle of early life, was beginning to imagine predators. Real predators. Not the small, harmless fish that nibbled on plants or scavenged in the silt, but the kind of creatures that made other creatures disappear. You could call them monsters, though to them it was just dinner. And among their favourite snacks, long before whales or giant squids ever existed, were the first sharks. Before we meet those hunters, I'd like to know, where are you listening from tonight? Somewhere near the sea, perhaps? Or maybe a city far from any shoreline, where the only waves come from passing cars? Wherever you are, just take a breath, a slow one. Imagine that instead of air, it's water pressing gently around you. You're suspended, weightless, drifting. Because to understand the Devonian Period, the so-called Age of Fishes, you have to let go of everything familiar. There were no mammals, no birds, not even dinosaurs. The world was ruled by the water, and what swam within it was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. If you find this quiet journey soothing, maybe give it a like, or subscribe if you'd like to drift through more science made for rest rather than rush. It helps this little corner of calm reach others who might also need to trade their worries for a slow current and a softer kind of curiosity. Now, let's slip beneath the surface, because somewhere down there, in the dim green light of a half-formed world, the first sharks were gliding through the shallows, and something even larger was waiting for them. To imagine the Devonian Ocean is to picture a world both recognisable and alien. The continents were scattered like islands across a planet that was warmer than ours, with high levels of carbon dioxide in the air and no ice at the poles. Coral reefs bloomed across the shallow seas, immense living structures stretching for hundreds of miles, home to a bewildering variety of early fish, mollusks and crustaceans. The water itself would have shimmered with plankton, and the seafloor in many places was a shifting garden of sponges, algae and soft corals. It sounds idyllic until you remember that this world was also filled with teeth. The Devonian was when nature began experimenting with the idea of predators that could bite, crush and tear rather than just swallow. Evolution, it seems, was feeling ambitious. At this time, sharks were still new, not the sleek grey hunters we know now, but small cartilaginous fish with fragile skeletons, thin skin, and a nervous energy that made them dart through the shallows like anxious arrows. The earliest of them, creatures like Cladocelache or Stethocanthus, were only a few feet long. They had no bones, only cartilage, and they lacked the layered, serrated teeth of modern sharks. But even in this primitive form, they were remarkable. They could swim faster than most of their prey, turn sharply, and sense faint movements in the water. They were, in essence, the prototype of one of evolution's most successful blueprints, a design that would last for hundreds of millions of years. But the Devonian wasn't just about the sharks. It was about what surrounded them, what chased them, and occasionally what swallowed them whole. You see, the seas of that age were ruled not by sharks, but by fish with armour. These were the placoderms, creatures so heavily plated that they looked half mechanical. Imagine a fish whose head and shoulders were encased in bone, like a medieval knight's helmet fused to its body. Behind that armoured front, its tail and fins trailed freely, giving it both protection and power. They were the first animals to develop true jaws, a feature that changed everything. Before jaws, most life fed by filter or suction, pulling in whatever fit through a soft mouth. But once jaws arrived, so did choice, aggression, and the ability to bite through more than just plankton. The oceans, once relatively peaceful, were now places where everything was either predator or prey. Among these early jawed fish was one that would become legend, Dunkleosteus. If you've ever seen an illustration of it, you probably remember the mouth first. Instead of teeth, it had sharpened bony plates that acted like enormous shears, capable of slicing through armour, bone and muscle with terrifying efficiency. Its head alone could measure over 1 metre long, and when it opened its jaws, the suction created could pull in anything unfortunate enough to be nearby. By all estimates, this creature could grow up to 9 or 10 metres, roughly the length of a bus, and its bite force may have rivaled that of a modern crocodile or great white shark. But this was hundreds of millions of years before either of those animals existed. In the Devonian, Dunkleosteus was king. What's fascinating, though, is that this monstrous fish didn't appear out of nowhere. It was part of a long evolutionary arms race that began when fish first developed armour to protect themselves from predators, only for other fish to evolve stronger jaws to bite through that armour. This constant back and forth escalation shaped the Devonian ecosystem. The sharks, smaller and more flexible, were caught in the middle. They weren't strong enough to compete with the armoured giants head-on, so they evolved in another direction, speed and stealth. Their skeletons, made of cartilage instead of bone, allowed them to move with a fluidity the placoderms couldn't match. Where a Dunkleosteus had to turn like a tank, a shark could pivot on a dime and vanish into the gloom. It wasn't a fair fight, but it didn't have to be. Evolution rarely cares about fairness, only survival. Still, there were times when being small and fast wasn't enough. Fossil evidence suggests that even the earliest sharks bore the marks of attack, bite patterns that matched the jaws of large placoderms and other predatory fish. These weren't delicate nibbles. They were crushing, decisive bites that split bodies open. It's a strange thought, that the ancestors of today's top marine predators were once the ones being hunted. It reminds us that dominance in nature is never permanent. Every ruler of the sea is just a future fossil waiting for its replacement. The Devonian period stretched over some 60 million years, from around 419 to 359 million years ago, and during that time the balance between sharks and their rivals shifted constantly. Early on, the armoured placoderms held the advantage. They were the heavyweights of the sea, slow but unstoppable. But as the eons passed, the environment began to favour agility. Reefs expanded, coastlines changed, and open water became more common. In these new conditions, speed and sensory awareness mattered more than armour. Sharks, with their lighter bodies and keen senses, began to thrive. They developed electroreceptors to detect faint electrical signals in the water, an adaptation so advanced that modern sharks still use it today. It's almost poetic that the very creatures once bullied by giants would inherit the world after those giants fell. But before that could happen, the Devonian oceans had to test every form life could imagine. There were fish shaped like torpedoes, others like armoured boxes, and some that looked more like experiments gone wrong. Many of them vanished as quickly as they appeared, victims of competition, climate shifts, or sheer bad luck. The seas were full of strange forms, lobe-finned fish that would one day crawl onto land, eel-like swimmers with bony heads, and early ray-like creatures gliding just above the seabed. Each one played a part in a slow, intricate dance of evolution, and through it all sharks survived by staying small, staying fast, and staying alive. If you were to stand on a Devonian shore, you might not even notice them. The land at that time was mostly barren rock and moss, with the first real forests just beginning to form. Giant arthropods, like metre-long millipedes, crawled among primitive plants, and dragonflies the size of hawks filled the air. But it was in the water that the real drama unfolded. The shallows teemed with life, while deeper waters hid the true predators. Somewhere out there, beyond the reefs and sediment, the great armoured fish prowled, their silhouettes gliding like moving fortresses, and scattered among them, darting in flashes of grey and silver, the first sharks tried not to be noticed. Occasionally they failed. What makes this period so intriguing isn't just the creatures themselves, but the way they set the stage for everything that followed. The Devonian was when vertebrate life, the kind with backbones, learned to dominate the planet. It was when the concept of the predator became refined, efficient and terrifying. It was when nature first explored what it means to be hunted and to hunt back. The monsters that ate sharks weren't just creatures of brute strength. They were milestones in the long, winding story of survival. Every bite, every escape, every adaptation added another line to that story, and we're still reading it today in the layers of rock and the fossils hidden within. Even now, when paleontologists uncover a fossilized shark spine with the distinctive gouges of a Dunkleosteus's bite, it feels almost personal. It's a record of violence older than trees, a reminder that even the most fearsome animals had to learn humility once. Those scars in stone speak of a world where every meal was a battle, and every survivor carried the memory of what it took to stay alive. If you listen closely, they whisper something simple, that power always shifts, and that sometimes the only path to endurance is to be small, quick, and clever enough to adapt when everything else goes extinct. In a way, the Devonian Ocean was like a slow rehearsal for the rest of life's grand performance. The actors changed, but the script stayed the same. One species rose, another fell, the stage shifted, and the lights dimmed on the great armoured monsters that once ruled. But the sharks, fragile, underestimated and endlessly resourceful, never left the stage. They simply waited for the curtain to rise again. And as we drift from this ancient sea toward the next part of our story, the water grows darker, quieter. The armour-plated titans still rule for now, and the sharks still swim cautiously in their shadows. But tides, both literal and evolutionary, are beginning to turn. Something new is stirring in the deep, and even the monsters that once devoured sharks will soon face an ending of their own. When the world belonged to water, the continents were still half-formed thoughts drifting in the heat of a restless planet. The air was thick with carbon dioxide, the sky faintly tinted by volcanic haze, and the sea stretched almost endlessly, swallowing most of the horizon. It was an oceanic Earth, a place where life had committed fully to the water long before it ever considered land. Everything that breathed, hunted, hid, or died did so beneath the waves, and if you could have stood anywhere on that ancient shoreline, it might have felt less like standing on a planet and more like balancing on the edge of something alive. The world pulsed with tides, oxygen flowed differently, and every ripple on the surface was the echo of something evolving below. Back then, continents were wandering. The supercontinent Gondwana sprawled across the southern hemisphere, a massive mosaic of what would one day become Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, and the Indian subcontinent. In the north, smaller landmasses like Euramerica floated apart, colliding slowly over millions of years. Between them stretched shallow seas, broad, sunlit expanses teeming with life. These shallow waters were like enormous nurseries for evolution, warm, oxygenated, and filled with minerals that fed coral reefs and algae blooms. Most of the creatures that lived there would never have seen open ocean. They stayed close to the coastlines, to reefs and lagoons, to the light that filtered down through greenish water. It was a world in motion, but its pace was so slow that only fossils can now tell us what changed and how. If you could dive into one of those Devonian seas, the first thing you'd notice is the strangeness of the light. The sun would reach only so far before dissolving into a murky twilight. Suspended in the water were clouds of plankton, tiny organisms that turned sunlight into energy, and, in doing so, made the oceans bloom. These drifting specks of life supported everything else, from tiny crustaceans to large filter feeders. The water was alive with motion, small schools of jawless fish weaving through patches of coral, worm-like creatures burrowing in the sediment, and trilobites scuttling along the bottom. Everywhere you looked, there was life trying something new. It was an experimental age when nature hadn't yet decided what worked best. Shells came in every imaginable shape. Fins sprouted in odd places, and armour grew thicker as mouths grew sharper. It's easy to forget that this watery world existed long before the dinosaurs, long before birds or mammals or even flowering plants. The Devonian Ocean was its own universe, and the beings within it were as complex and competitive as anything alive today. In a sense, this was Earth's first real civilization, one made entirely of gills and fins instead of cities and steel. Each species had its territory, its strategies, and its predators. The balance was fragile but constant. For every hunter, there was a faster escape artist. For every armoured prey, a stronger jaw evolved somewhere close by. Among the most dominant creatures were those with skeletons made of bone rather than cartilage. This may sound like a small distinction, but it was revolutionary. Bone allowed for sturdier muscles, better leverage, and stronger bites. It also made possible the rise of armoured fish, the placoderms, that would come to define this period. Some were no larger than a hand, others as long as a small bus. Many had bodies that looked more like machines than animals, solid plates covering their heads, jointed necks allowing them to open their mouths wide, and heavy tails built for short bursts of speed. They were evolution's first real attempt at large-scale armour, and for a time they dominated the seas completely. The ocean floor in those days must have looked like an alien marketplace. Coral towers rose from the sediment like ancient cities, covered in sponges and branching organisms. Crinoids, animals that looked like flowers but were actually related to starfish, waved their feathery arms in the currents, catching food that drifted by. Ammonites, early relatives of squid and octopuses, floated with their coiled shells gleaming faintly in the filtered light. Every inch of space was occupied. Predators patrolled the reefs. Smaller fish darted between coral structures, and scavengers cleaned up what was left behind. If you listened closely, not that sound travels the same underwater, you might almost imagine the hum of a living machine, a whole biosphere turning gears beneath the waves. Sharks, in contrast, were still finding their place. They weren't yet the apex predators of the ocean, but more like opportunists. They scavenged, ambushed, and explored. Some species were barely recognizable as sharks at all. One had a strange, flat spine rising from its back like a sail. Another had teeth shaped for grinding rather than slicing. They were evolutionary prototypes, each generation tweaking the design, trying to find what worked. It would take millions of years before sharks perfected the sleek, torpedo-like shape we associate with them now. In the meantime, they were small players in a much larger game dominated by the armoured giants. Life in the Devonian was constantly adapting to both predators and environment. The oceans were rich in nutrients, but they could also turn deadly when oxygen levels dropped. Algae blooms sometimes spread so thickly that they suffocated the water beneath them, leaving layers of dead zones where nothing survived. Volcanic eruptions poured ash into the seas, altering chemistry and temperature. Earth was unstable, dynamic, and the creatures living in its oceans had to evolve or vanish. Those that managed to survive were the ones that learned flexibility, not in muscle, but in design. Sharks, with their simple skeletons and efficient reproduction, were better equipped for change than their heavily armoured rivals. It was a small advantage, almost invisible at first, but it would one day tip the balance of power entirely. For now, though, the giants ruled. The most fearsome among them, Dunkleosteus, was not just large but efficient. Its jaws could snap open in a fraction of a second, creating a vacuum that sucked prey inward. Once inside, there was no escape. Fossils show clean, sharp incisions in the bones of other fish, marks that match perfectly with Dunkleosteus's bony plates. Its bite could crush through armour, break through bone, and tear apart anything soft. Sharks were on its menu not because it preferred them, but because they were there, abundant, easy to catch, and too fragile to resist. It's strange to think that these early sharks, which would one day dominate the oceans for hundreds of millions of years, were once little more than snacks to a creature that has been extinct for over 350 million years. But in the Devonian, nothing stayed still for long. Evolution was relentless, and as soon as one group of creatures gained the upper hand, another began finding ways to challenge it. The coral reefs that stretched across the seas weren't just habitats, they were battlegrounds. Predators hunted there, scavengers cleaned up the leftovers, and smaller species used the coral's labyrinths to hide. Each reef was its own tiny world, filled with its own dramas. A shark might dart into a gap between corals to escape a pursuing placoderm, only to run into another predator lying in wait. The Devonian Sea wasn't just filled with life, it was layered with it, stacked in a complex web of interactions that mirrored modern ecosystems more than primitive ones. If you could have hovered in one place and watched over time, you would have seen the shapes of these creatures change across generations. Fins shifted position, mouths grew wider, scales became thicker or thinner depending on who was chasing whom. It was evolution in constant negotiation, every adaptation a response to another. For instance, when placoderms developed heavier armour, sharks responded with greater speed and agility. When reef fish began hiding in tighter spaces, predators evolved narrower snouts or flexible jaws to reach them. Each improvement in one species echoed through the ecosystem like a wave, forcing change in everything else. This was how complexity grew, not from competition alone, but from the endless feedback between hunter and hunted. While the oceans were teeming, the land above them was just beginning to stir. The Devonian is often called the Age of Fishes, but it was also when plants conquered land. Early trees, primitive relatives of ferns, were spreading across damp coastlines, binding soil and slowly reshaping the planet's atmosphere. The oxygen levels began to rise, cooling the climate and creating more stable weather. Over millions of years, this shift would transform the environment, but in the meantime, most of life remained in the water. Land was still an uncertain place, filled with challenges like gravity, desiccation, and ultraviolet light. Only a few adventurous creatures like lobe-finned fish dared to venture out. The ocean remained the centre of existence, the cradle and the arena, where the drama of life and death played out daily and without pause. Sometimes it's easy to think of prehistory as static, a list of creatures that appeared and vanished. But in the Devonian, time was more like a continuous motion picture. Whole lineages rose and fell, ecosystems flourished and collapsed, and each extinction made room for something new. There were at least 2 major extinction events during this period, both of which reshaped marine life. One was triggered by changes in sea level and oxygen depletion, wiping out many reef-building organisms. The other, later in the Devonian, hit the armoured fish particularly hard. The giants that had ruled for millions of years began to disappear, leaving behind smaller, more adaptable species. It wasn't sudden, not like the dramatic asteroid strikes of later ages. It was a slow unravelling, a long, quiet decline that gave faster creatures, like sharks, the opening they needed. When we think of monsters that ate sharks, it's easy to focus only on the teeth and the power, but the real story lies in the transitions. Every predator, no matter how strong, exists within the boundaries of its time. The Devonian placoderms were unstoppable in their world, yet that same armour that made them invincible also made them inflexible. When the seas changed, they couldn't adapt. The sharks, lighter and more experimental, endured. It's a reminder that evolution doesn't reward strength alone, it rewards resilience. In a sense, the Devonian was a rehearsal for everything that came after, from reptiles to mammals to us. The same rule still applies: adapt or disappear. In this ancient world, night and day didn't mean much to the creatures below. Light barely reached the depths where many of them lived. The rhythm of their existence was set instead by temperature, current, and hunger. There was no silence, just the constant motion of life feeding and being fed upon. The Devonian Ocean wasn't hostile, it was simply indifferent, the way all natural systems are. Each creature filled its role until it could no longer, and then something else took its place. The sharks that survived those early ages carried with them a design so efficient that it needed little change over the next 400 million years. Their survival wasn't luck. It was the result of being built for a world that never stopped shifting. And so, when we imagine those monsters that once hunted sharks, it's not just about the jaws or the size. It's about the world that created them. A world ruled by water, by experimentation, by the endless testing of what life could be. The Devonian wasn't just an age of fishes. It was an age of discovery, of possibility. Everything that would come later, from reptiles to birds to humans, owes something to those first predators and prey. The rules of survival were written there, in salt and bone and motion, and they've never really changed. The world that belonged to water eventually began to dry its feet on the shores, but for now, in this story, we stay submerged. The reefs still hum with life, the armoured fish still rule, the sharks still dart through the shadows. Somewhere above, volcanoes rumble and the continents inch toward each other, but down here, the ocean doesn't care. It just keeps breathing, slow and vast and patient, holding within it every secret of what's to come. And among those secrets, something small and flexible waits, an idea shaped like a shark, ready to inherit the sea once the monsters have finished their meal. If you picture a shark, the image that comes to mind is probably sleek and efficient, something honed by millions of years of evolution, a creature that looks as though the ocean itself decided to become an animal. But the first sharks didn't look like that. They were smaller, stranger, and uncertain in form, as if nature were still sketching ideas and couldn't decide which version to keep. Their reign began quietly, almost unnoticed, in the corners of reefs and the shadows beneath the armoured giants that ruled the seas. They weren't yet the terror of the deep, they were the survivors hiding in plain sight. The earliest known sharks appeared over 420 million years ago, near the end of the Silurian period, and by the Devonian they had already spread widely through the oceans. These were primitive forms, cartilaginous fish, whose skeletons were soft, lightweight, and rarely preserved as fossils. What remains of them are mostly teeth and fragments of scales, tiny clues that tell scientists how adaptable these creatures were. A complete skeleton is almost unheard of, which makes reconstructing their lives more like detective work than discovery. Still, from these fragments, a picture has emerged. Small, agile hunters moving with precision through shallow seas, built not for brute strength, but for survival through efficiency. Unlike the heavy-plated placoderms, sharks had skeletons made entirely of cartilage, a flexible, rubbery tissue that doesn't fossilize well but offered enormous advantages in life. Cartilage is lighter than bone, allowing sharks to float more easily without needing the air bladders that many bony fish later evolved. It also bends, which meant sharks could twist, pivot, and accelerate faster than any of their armoured contemporaries. This agility gave them the one edge that mattered most in an ocean full of slower, heavily protected creatures: control of movement. In a world where jaws were new and armour was everywhere, being able to move first and move fast was often the difference between predator and prey. One of the earliest known sharks, Cladocelache, lived around 370 million years ago. It reached lengths of up to 2 meters, had a torpedo-shaped body, and lacked the scales that covered most other fish. Its mouth was positioned at the front of its head rather than underneath, giving it a forward-facing attack angle like modern fast-swimming sharks. Fossils show a body built for speed, smooth skin, powerful tail fins, and large gills that could draw in oxygen efficiently. Inside, its digestive system was simple, streamlined for a predator that didn't waste time chewing. When it caught something, it swallowed it whole. Remnants of other fish have been found inside Cladocelache fossils, sometimes swallowed head first, which suggests a precise, practiced hunter rather than an opportunistic scavenger. Still, Cladocilic wasn't the only shark-shaped experiment happening in the Devonian. The seas were full of related species, each trying its own variation on the design. Some had long, eel-like bodies suited to weaving through reef crevices. Others had spiny dorsal fins for defence, like Climatius, a small sharp-featured shark whose back was armed with a row of defensive spines. There were also oddities like Stethocanthus, sometimes called the anvil shark, with a flat brush-shaped structure on its back that has puzzled scientists for decades. It may have been used in mating displays or intimidation, though no one is certain. Each of these species represents an evolutionary branch that ended long ago, but collectively they show how versatile the shark blueprint was even in its earliest form. At this stage in Earth's history, sharks were not the top predators. That title belonged to the armoured placoderms, particularly Dunkleosteus and its kin, whose crushing jaws could break through almost anything. But while those giants dominated the open waters, sharks found niches of their own. They thrived in shallower regions, along reefs, and in coastal lagoons where larger predators couldn't maneuver easily. Their small size made them less visible and allowed them to exploit food sources others ignored. In a way, their quiet reign was defined by adaptability rather than dominance. They filled gaps, learned to move between environments, and avoided extinction by never specialising too much. The contrast between sharks and their contemporaries was stark. Placoderms were armoured fortresses. Their skeletons were heavy, their bodies rigid, and their movements deliberate. Sharks were the opposite, light, flexible, and responsive. Where a placoderm might rely on power and armour, a shark relied on awareness and timing. Even this early in their evolution, sharks possessed sensory systems that made them remarkable hunters. Their lateral lines could detect vibrations from struggling prey, and their keen sense of smell allowed them to follow faint chemical trails through the water. Later species would refine these abilities even further, developing electroreception to detect the electrical fields produced by living organisms, but the foundation for those senses was already being laid during the Devonian. Their teeth tell another part of the story. Early sharks had simpler teeth than modern species, small, smooth and conical, designed more for gripping than slicing. These teeth were arranged in rows that could be replaced throughout the shark's life. When one broke or wore down, another slid forward to take its place. It was a simple system, yet astonishingly effective. Fossil evidence shows that sharks could produce thousands of teeth over a lifetime. This constant renewal meant they could maintain a perfect set of tools even in the harshest conditions. It's one of the main reasons their lineage has lasted so long. Where other species evolved complex but fragile mechanisms for feeding, sharks kept their design simple and reliable. It's worth imagining what a Devonian reef might have looked like from a shark's point of view. Above, rays of sunlight sliced through the surface, flickering across coral structures that formed dense mazes of colour and shadow. Small fish darted between gaps in the coral, while strange creatures like early lungfish moved sluggishly near the bottom. A shark glided through it all, silent except for the faint ripple of its fins. It could sense the pressure waves of movement around it, smell the chemical signatures of injured prey, and adjust its course without thinking. Its body was built for this world, not the brute force brawls of open water giants, but the subtle choreography of survival among the reefs. And while it hunted, it was also hunted. The same reefs that offered safety could become traps. A shadow overhead might not be another fish but the armoured head of a placoderm descending an ambush. Even if the shark escaped, it would do so narrowly, forced to grow smarter and faster. This constant pressure forged resilience. Every generation that survived passed on traits that improved its odds. Better speed, sharper senses, a keener instinct for danger. Over time, these refinements added up to something extraordinary. An animal that could not only survive extinction events, but thrive in their aftermath. Sharks' reproductive strategies were also part of their success. While many fish scattered their eggs and left them to chance, some early sharks retained embryos inside their bodies, giving birth to live young, or protecting their eggs until they were ready to hatch. This increased the chances of survival in a dangerous ocean. Fossils suggest that some species had specialized egg cases with tough, leathery shells, an innovation that still exists in some sharks today. It's a small evolutionary detail, but in an environment where the weak were constantly devoured, even small advantages made a difference. Scientists studying early sharks often describe them as the ocean's first real specialists in efficiency. They didn't dominate their ecosystems through size or strength, but through design that required little energy to maintain. Their skeletons were light yet strong. Their skin was covered in dermal denticles, tiny tooth-like scales that reduced drag and made them nearly silent in the water. These features gave them a hydrodynamic advantage that even modern engineers still study when designing underwater vehicles. It's a testament to how refined the shark's form already was hundreds of millions of years ago. But perhaps the most fascinating part of their quiet reign is how unassuming it was. For all the monstrous creatures of the Devonian, it's the sharks, the small, quick, unarmoured ones, that would ultimately outlast the giants. They didn't conquer by fighting, they simply endured. When the great armoured placoderms went extinct near the end of the Devonian, sharks were already positioned to take over the vacant niches. Their flexibility allowed them to adapt to the changing seas that followed, where oxygen levels fluctuated and coral reefs collapsed. Other lineages vanished completely, but sharks persisted, slipping through history like shadows that never quite disappear. Some fossils even hint that sharks were beginning to diversify long before the extinction of their rivals. Different species occupied different parts of the ocean, some staying near the surface, others haunting deeper waters where sunlight never reached. A few developed flattened bodies for resting on the seafloor, precursors to the rays and skates that would appear millions of years later. The shark lineage was branching quietly, experimenting with every possible way to live in water. Each branch carried forward a part of the design that worked, while those that didn't simply faded away. This slow, methodical persistence is one of the most striking aspects of shark evolution. Where many prehistoric species rise quickly and fall dramatically, sharks seem to evolve at their own pace, rarely making sudden leaps. They don't need to. Their design is so effective that most changes are refinements rather than reinventions. When paleontologists compare modern sharks with their Devonian ancestors, they find that many of the core features are unchanged. The position of the fins, the structure of the tail, even the general body shape. These elements were established early and have endured for over 400 million years. In evolutionary terms, that's as close to perfection as nature allows. Still, the Devonian oceans were not a peaceful place for them. The balance between predator and prey shifted constantly. Even the smallest misstep could mean becoming part of someone else's meal. Every shark that survived carried the memory of that risk encoded in its DNA. Their nervous systems became tuned to movement, their instincts sharpened by fear as much as hunger. This is perhaps why sharks never lost their cautious intelligence. They were not reckless killers, despite how they're often imagined. They were pragmatic survivors, shaped by a world that rewarded awareness over aggression. The quiet reign of the first sharks lasted for millions of years, measured not by dominance but by persistence. They shared their seas with armoured titans, with strange finned experiments, and with creatures that would one day give rise to amphibians and reptiles. Through all of it, they adapted, waited, and endured. And when the end of the Devonian came, a time of dying reefs, falling oxygen, and mass extinction, it was the sharks that slipped through the cracks of catastrophe and emerged into the next era largely unchanged. The monsters that had once eaten them were gone. The seas were emptier, quieter, and ready for something new. What began as a quiet reign would soon become a lasting one. The sharks that survived the Devonian carried forward the traits that had saved them: speed, adaptability, and simplicity. These qualities would define their future, ensuring that long after the armoured fish vanished, and long after the dinosaurs came and went, sharks would still glide through the oceans as if nothing had ever changed. In truth, for them, not much had. The sea was still their home, the rhythm of life still their guide, and the balance between predator and prey still the same as it had been in the beginning. And so, as we drift forward in this story, the armoured titans of the Devonian still stalk the reefs, the sharks still move like living shadows, and the world itself is beginning to shift beneath them. The continents are closing in, the oceans are changing temperature, the first forests are taking hold on land. Soon the water will no longer belong to one kind of creature alone, and when the monsters rise to test the sharks again, they will find that the quiet survivors of the Devonian have learned more than just how to flee. They've learned how to outlast. By the time sharks had found their rhythm in the Devonian seas, another group of creatures had already claimed the title of apex predator. They were the armoured lords of their age, the hunters that even hunters feared. These were the placoderms, and among them were giants so formidable that the first sharks, small, quick, and clever though they were, spent much of their time staying out of sight. If the early sharks were the prototypes of sleek endurance, the placoderms were the prototype of power. They were not elegant, and they didn't need to be. They were living fortresses, equipped with jaws that could shear through bone and armour thick enough to shrug off anything short of another placoderm's bite. To understand what it meant to live beneath them is to imagine the ocean not as an open expanse, but as a battlefield of slow-moving war machines. Every reef, every shoal, every stretch of open water had its hierarchy. The small fish fed on plankton. The sharks fed on the small fish. And above them both were the armoured hunters that fed on everything else. These were the creatures that turned the Devonian into the age of fishes, not because of their numbers, but because of their scale. The most famous among them, Dunkleosteus, was not just large, it was a phenomenon. Growing up to 10 metres in length, its skull alone could stretch over a metre. It didn't have teeth in the modern sense. Instead, its jaws were lined with sharp, bony plates that acted like massive shears. When it bit down, those plates met with the precision of a guillotine, slicing through muscle and shell alike. Estimates of its bite force suggest something in the range of 6,000 newtons, comparable to the bite of a modern crocodile, but concentrated at the tip of a blade rather than across rows of teeth. The effect was devastating. A single strike could cut through the armoured shell of another placoderm, or through the body of a shark before it even had time to react. What made Dunkleosteus so dangerous wasn't just its jaws, it was how it used them. Fossil analysis shows that its skull was built on a 4-bar linkage system, a complex arrangement of bones that allowed the jaw to snap open at incredible speed and close with crushing force. When it opened its mouth, it created a suction that could pull prey straight in. The action was mechanical, precise, and far faster than any other predator of its time. It didn't chase as much as it struck, waiting for prey to drift close before unleashing a motion that turned water into a weapon. Once inside those jaws, nothing escaped. But Dunkleosteus was only one of many. The Devonian oceans were full of armoured predators, each with its own interpretation of how to dominate the sea. Some were massive like Dunkleosteus, while others were smaller but faster, with streamlined armour and agile fins. The group as a whole, the placoderms, had diversified into hundreds of species, from small bottom dwellers to open water hunters. They were united by their distinctive feature. Armour plates fused into their skin. This armour protected their heads and shoulders while leaving the rest of the body free for swimming. The result was a creature that could survive blows no other fish could endure and deliver attacks that few could withstand. In a world before reptiles, before even amphibians had fully conquered the land, the placoderms were the first animals to bring true aggression to vertebrate life. They were the original experiment in complex predation, the point where evolution began combining defense, offense, and strategy in a single organism. They didn't just survive, they ruled. For the smaller sharks of the time, living alongside them must have been a daily exercise in calculation. The sharks had the advantage of speed and manoeuvrability, but one mistake, one wrong turn into open water could mean instant death. Fossilised remains of early sharks show bite marks that match the shapes of placoderm jaws. The edges of those wounds are smooth and curved, the kind of damage only a bony blade could make. In some cases, entire sections of skeletons are missing, as if bitten clean through. These were not random attacks, they were targeted, efficient kills. The hunters above the hunters had learned to recognise the movement patterns of smaller fish, and they used patience as effectively as power. A Devonian ocean, seen from above, would have looked peaceful enough. Broad patches of coral reef stretched toward the light, shoals of fish shimmered like clouds, and the surface broke gently in the wind. But below that calm surface the scene changed. In deeper channels the water grew murkier, and the outlines of massive armoured predators moved in and out of view. Their eyes, often positioned high on their heads, could catch the silhouettes of prey against the light above. They rose from the shadows, jaws opening with hydraulic precision, and vanished again into the gloom before the water had time to settle. Sharks, sensing the vibrations, would scatter in all directions, each trying to blend into the haze. Survival meant knowing how to disappear. It's strange to think that the ancestors of modern sharks were shaped not only by their own evolution, but by the fear of creatures now long extinct. The adaptations that make sharks such efficient hunters today, their alertness, their sensitivity to motion, their ability to react faster than almost any other fish, were forged in the presence of these armoured giants. Every muscle twitch, every reflex, every pattern of movement that helped a shark evade a predator became part of its evolutionary toolkit. In that sense, Dunkleosteus and its kin didn't just dominate their era, they sculpted the future. The placoderms themselves were a remarkably diverse lineage. Some species lived near the surface, feeding on smaller fish and crustaceans. Others haunted the seafloor, crushing shellfish and armoured invertebrates with their heavy jaws. There were even species that lived in freshwater rivers and lakes, showing that this group could adapt to almost any aquatic environment. Their success was astonishing, but it came with a hidden weakness: specialization. The very armour that made them powerful also made them dependent on stable conditions. Their size required enormous amounts of food, and their heavy bodies limited their ability to migrate when the environment changed. In an age when the Earth's climate was volatile, that rigidity would prove costly. Still, during their prime, the placoderms left almost no ecological niche unfilled. Smaller species like Bothria lepis lived along the bottom, filtering detritus and plants, while mid-sized predators like Cocosteus hunted in coastal waters. Each filled a specific role, and together they formed the backbone of Devonian marine ecosystems. Sharks occupied the periphery, important but secondary. They cleaned up the leftovers, hunted small prey, and avoided direct confrontation with the armoured elites. Yet even as the placoderms grew stronger, sharks continued to evolve quietly in their shadow. It's a dynamic that repeats throughout evolutionary history. While one group dominates, another adapts quietly, waiting for its turn. The interaction between these two lineages must have been constant and brutal. When a placoderm attacked, it did so with overwhelming force, but its armour made it slower. A shark, on the other hand, could strike quickly but had to flee just as fast. It was a balance between power and precision. Neither had a clear advantage, but their competition drove both to refine their designs. Placoderms evolved stronger jaws and faster strikes, while sharks improved their speed and sensing ability. Over millions of years, this evolutionary arms race shaped the anatomy of both groups. It was one of the earliest examples of predator-prey escalation on a planetary scale. The fossil record captures only fragments of this struggle, but the story it tells is unmistakable. You can see it in the distribution of bite marks, in the wear patterns on armour plates, and in the teeth scattered across ancient seabeds. Some sites show layers of crushed placoderm remains mixed with shark fossils, suggesting that the two died in the same catastrophic events, perhaps volcanic eruptions or sudden drops in oxygen. Other sites show isolated shark fossils with evidence of predation, their spines bent or bitten through. These are not random accidents. They're the record of a world in constant conflict, where even the most powerful hunter could become prey in a heartbeat. What's remarkable is how short the reign of the placoderms actually was in geological terms. They rose quickly in the early Devonian, flourished through the Middle Period, and were gone by the end. Their entire history spanned less than 70 million years, a blink compared to the 400 million year survival of sharks. For all their power, their dominance was temporary. When the global environment began to shift, when sea levels fell, reefs collapsed and oxygen levels dropped, the heavy specialized placoderms couldn't adapt fast enough. The smaller, lighter sharks could. They slipped through the gaps left behind by the giant's downfall not by fighting, but by enduring. Still, during their height, there was nothing in the ocean that could match a creature like Dunkleosteus. Its sheer size and power have made it a favourite of paleontologists and artists alike, often depicted as a prehistoric version of a killer whale or crocodile. Yet in life, it was probably stranger than that. Its body, despite its massive head, may have been relatively short and stubby, more like a compact torpedo than a long fish. This shape suggests bursts of speed followed by stillness, a predator that attacked with sudden explosive motion and then drifted slowly afterward. It didn't chase, it ambushed, it didn't waste energy, it waited. The efficiency of its hunting behaviour may explain how such a large predator could survive in ecosystems that were still developing complex food webs. Some researchers have compared Dunkleosteus to a prehistoric version of a great white shark, not in appearance, but in ecological role. Both occupy the same position in their respective food chains, apex predators that regulate other species by keeping populations in balance. In the Devonian, that role meant controlling the explosive diversification of smaller fish. Without such predators, the oceans could have become overcrowded and unstable. In that sense, the placoderms were not just monsters, they were managers of an emerging ecosystem, keeping the balance through violence. It's also worth noting that their dominance wasn't absolute. In some parts of the world, particularly near coastal shallows, sharks and smaller bony fish had already begun carving out independent niches. There the giants were too cumbersome to follow. Reefs acted as natural barriers, protecting smaller creatures and fostering diversity. These microhabitats became safe zones for innovation, places where evolution could experiment without interference from the armoured hunters. Over time, the species that evolved in these protected regions would inherit the Earth's oceans after the placoderms' decline. It was as if the future was quietly preparing itself in the background while the giants roamed the stage. When you look at the fossil record today, the placoderms leave an impression of dominance, but also of impermanence. Their armour preserved them beautifully, giving us more fossils of them than of their soft-bodied rivals. Sharks, with their cartilage skeletons left only teeth and traces. That imbalance can make it seem as though the placoderms were the only story of the Devonian seas, when in fact they were just one chapter in a much longer narrative. The hunters above the hunters were extraordinary, but they were also temporary. Evolution builds its empires on what works for the moment, and the moment always changes. Still, for the span of millions of years, these armoured predators reigned over a world unlike anything that exists now. Their shadows stretched across the reefs, their jaws carved paths through schools of fish, and their presence defined what it meant to be powerful. For every creature that swam beneath them, including the early sharks, life was a test of adaptation. And for the sharks themselves, that test would eventually become an advantage. When the era of armour ended and the ocean shifted toward mobility and precision, they were ready. The giants didn't know it, but the small, unarmoured swimmers they hunted were the future. Each time a shark slipped away into the darkness, it was carrying the design of survival forward. Each escape, each narrow evasion, was another small victory in an evolutionary war that didn't end with blood but with time. And time, as always, favoured those who could change. The Devonian seas would not stay as they were forever. The world was moving toward upheaval, tectonic shifts, volcanic winters, dying reefs, and falling oxygen. The placoderms, for all their power, would soon meet challenges they couldn't overcome, but the sharks, light and flexible, were already adapting to what came next. The monsters that ate them would vanish, leaving behind fossils and legends. The survivors would rise, not as conquerors, but as the quiet inheritors of everything that came before. And as we continue drifting through this story, the armoured hunters still glide through the murk, their jaws sharp, their reign unchallenged. For now, they own the ocean. But in the distance, something small and unarmoured moves differently. Faster, more fluid, less constrained by the weight of its past. The balance is beginning to shift, and the age of armour is slowly, imperceptibly, giving way to the age of movement. The hunters above the hunters have no reason to notice it yet, they never do. Long before teeth became sharp and familiar things, long before predators learned how to bite with purpose, the act of feeding in the ocean was more like drifting through a buffet than hunting. Early fish simply inhaled what they could fit through their mouths. They filtered plankton, they gulped, they waited for food to come close enough to swallow. It was simple and safe. But evolution, being what it is, doesn't leave simplicity alone for long. Somewhere deep in the Devonian seas, bones began to harden around the mouths of fish, joints formed, and muscle started pulling in new directions. The ocean was about to discover something it had never known before: force. The appearance of jaws was one of the great turning points in the history of life. It's difficult to overstate how revolutionary that change was. Before jaws, most creatures depended on chance encounters with food. After jaws, they could take it. They could seize, crush, tear, and decide what lived or died. That single innovation rewrote the rules of the ocean. The Devonian became the testing ground for this new idea, a time when bone met motion, and feeding became a deliberate act of violence rather than a passive exchange. It was here that the line between predator and prey became clear for the first time. The architects of this transformation were the placoderms. These heavily armoured fish had taken the concept of bone and built their entire existence around it. Their heads and shoulders were covered in thick plates fused like natural helmets. Beneath that armour, their jaws evolved into complex mechanical systems capable of generating enormous power. When they bit, it wasn't just a clamp, it was a precision strike. The front plates acted as blades, while secondary muscles behind them drove the movement with astonishing speed. The result was a living machine built for cutting. The most advanced of these designs belonged to Dunkleosteus, the same giant predator that ruled the late Devonian seas. Its skull shows clear evidence of the four-bar linkage system, a biomechanical structure made of interconnected bones that act like levers. When one bone moves, it transfers force through the others, multiplying it in the process. In Dunkleosteus, this mechanism allowed the lower jaw to drop open almost instantly, creating suction that pulled prey toward its mouth. Then, with a fraction of a second's delay, the upper jaw snapped shut with crushing strength. No other fish of the time had anything like it. It was, in effect, the first known example of an engineered feeding system in nature. To understand how extraordinary this was, you can compare it to modern animals. Crocodiles and great white sharks, for instance, use muscle power to generate bite force. But in Dunkleosteus, bone did much of the work. Its jaw operated like a trap designed to convert minimal muscle input into maximum output. In tests with digital reconstructions, researchers estimate that its bite could deliver more than 11,000 pounds of pressure per square inch at the edges of its bladed plates. That's enough to shear through armour, bone, or the thick shells of ancient invertebrates. Nothing else in the Devonian came close, but not all jaws were built for destruction. The early Devonian seas were full of experiments, fish trying out different versions of this new idea. Some jaws were small and lined with flat crushing plates for breaking shells. Others were narrow and needle-like, adapted for snatching quick-moving prey. In some species, the jaws didn't even have real teeth yet, just serrated edges of bone that acted like primitive cutting tools. Evolution at this point was running multiple trials at once. The result was an ocean full of prototypes, some fast, some clumsy, some surprisingly efficient. The Devonian wasn't just the age of fishes, it was the age of innovation. For the first sharks, this revolution posed both a challenge and an opportunity. Their skeletons were made of cartilage rather than bone, which limited how much crushing power they could generate. But cartilage being lighter gave them an entirely different advantage: speed. Instead of developing massive jaws like the placoderms, sharks refined the art of motion. Their bites became quick, repeatable and flexible. They didn't need to crack through armour, they needed to strike where armour wasn't. In that contrast between bone and cartilage, between brute strength and fluid movement, two evolutionary philosophies emerged. One favoured power, the other efficiency. The history of ocean life ever since has been a conversation between those two ideas. If you imagine a Devonian seascape, it's not hard to see how these designs shape the ecosystem. Coral reefs were the stage, built from vast colonies of early corals and sponges. Small fish darted between the crevices, feeding on algae and plankton. Above them, the shadows of predators passed slowly, their armour glinting faintly in the dim light. Every few moments one of those shadows would dip lower, jaws opening in that mechanical flash, and another creature's movement would end abruptly. The water was thick with the debris of feeding, bits of shell, scales and drifting silt, stirred up by the constant motion of hunters at work. But the jaws of metal and bone didn't just change how fish hunted, they changed how fish defended themselves. Prey began evolving thicker scales, faster reflexes and more complex behaviours. Some species developed schooling patterns to confuse predators, others buried themselves in sand or mud, hiding their soft bodies from the crushing jaws above. In this arms race, every adaptation led to another. The more efficient the predator became, the more ingenious its prey needed to be. For every bite that landed, there were hundreds that didn't. The balance between attack and escape became the central rhythm of life underwater. Among the smaller predators, variations on the jaw design began appearing almost as soon as it evolved. Some early sharks experimented with rows of replaceable teeth, structures that could fall out and regrow indefinitely. This innovation may have begun as a repair mechanism, but it quickly became a defining feature. Instead of relying on one set of teeth, sharks could afford to lose them with every hunt. Their jaws became living conveyor belts, each new tooth pushing the old ones forward. While placoderms could break anything, sharks could bite forever. That difference would matter when the seas began to change. The great armoured hunters, for all their might, were prisoners of their own construction. Their armour limited how far their jaws could open, and their heavy skulls slowed their reaction times. In stable environments they were unstoppable. But as conditions shifted, when oxygen levels dropped or prey species declined, their specialization became a liability. They couldn't adjust quickly enough. Sharks, with their lighter frames and regenerative systems, could. It was a subtle shift at first, barely noticeable, but it was the beginning of the end for the giants. Evolution rewards not just strength but adaptability, and cartilage proved to be a better long-term investment than bone. Still, while they lasted, the armoured hunters ruled absolutely. The evidence is written in fossils: jaws locked in combat, bite marks gouged into armour, and whole assemblages of shattered skeletons buried together. Some sites suggest mass feeding events, where multiple predators may have converged on a dying reef, devouring everything in reach. The power of their jaws left physical scars on the world, marks so deep they remain visible hundreds of millions of years later. When paleontologists find those fossils today, they can almost feel the violence behind them. A single bite from one of those predators could split rock-hard bone. Imagine what it did to soft flesh. For a long time, scientists believed that the placoderm's jaws were primitive compared to modern fish. That idea has changed completely in recent decades. With new imaging technology, researchers have discovered just how complex these ancient jaw systems really were. The internal structure of Dunkleosteus's skull, for instance, reveals interlocking joints, tendon attachment points, and mechanical leverage systems so advanced that they rival those of modern reptiles and mammals. In some ways, the evolution of jaws had already reached a level of sophistication in the Devonian that wouldn't be seen again for millions of years. This sophistication came with trade-offs. Armour and mechanical strength required energy. These predators needed enormous amounts of food to sustain themselves, and that meant constant hunting. The moment they stopped feeding, they began to starve. Sharks, on the other hand, could slow their metabolisms, glide for long periods, and survive on less. It's not hard to see how one design was destined to outlast the other. The jaws of metal and bone were magnificent, but they were also unsustainable. They represented an evolutionary extreme, a peak that could not hold. What's fascinating is that these predators didn't vanish because they failed in their function. They were simply too perfect for their time. They dominated the Devonian seas so completely that when the environment changed, they had nowhere left to go. Ecosystems built on singular strength tend to collapse quickly. When oxygen levels in the oceans dropped and food chains broke down, the massive armoured hunters couldn't adapt. Their jaws, their armour, their entire existence was tied to a world that was disappearing. In the aftermath, the lighter, less constrained creatures, the sharks, the ray-finned fish, the adaptable scavengers, filled the empty spaces. Evolution moved on, but the blueprint of those powerful jaws never disappeared completely. It lived on, reshaped, refined, and simplified in every predator that came after. Even today, echoes of those ancient jaws exist in the skeletons of modern animals. The same mechanical principles, the same leverage and motion, appear in crocodiles, big cats, and even humans. Our own jaw joints share structural similarities with those of the first armoured fish. When we chew, when we speak, we are using an evolutionary invention that began in the Devonian. The world's first predators didn't just define their era, they defined the physical mechanics of life itself. It's easy to think of these creatures as monsters, but they were also innovators. Each bite, each adaptation was part of a grand experiment in engineering. The Devonian wasn't a static age of giants. It was a workshop where nature tested materials and methods. Bone replaced cartilage in some lineages, armour evolved and disappeared, and joints became more complex. These early predators didn't just eat, they redefined what a body could do. The jaws of metal and bone were as much a technological revolution as a biological one, and while they faded from the world long ago, their influence never left. Every predator that bites, crushes or tears today is drawing on the same mechanical lineage that began with them. Sharks refined it. Reptiles reinforced it. Mammals inherited it. In that sense, the Devonian jaws were not a dead end at all. They were the prototype for everything that followed. If you could drift back through time and watch the ocean then, you'd see it not as a calm blue expanse, but as a living system of design and counter-design. Each creature was a response to another, each movement a test of an idea. The jaws that shattered armour also inspired speed. The armour that resisted jaws inspired intelligence. It was a feedback loop that would continue for eons, and at the heart of it all was that first moment when bone met motion, when the world's first bite cut through the silence and changed the course of evolution forever. Even now, when we study those fossils, we can still trace the logic behind their creation. The bones fit together like parts of a machine, every edge worn smooth by time but still functional in shape. They remind us that evolution is not random chaos, but the slow accumulation of efficiency. The Devonian predators were not mistakes. They were prototypes of precision. Their reign may have ended, but the principle that defined them, control through motion, remains as alive in today's oceans as it was in theirs. And so, as we move forward through this ancient world, the water still carries the echoes of those jaws closing on prey, the distant vibration of impact through bone and flesh. The armoured hunters remain at the top of their food chain for now, their power unquestioned. But beneath them, smaller, faster shapes are already learning different lessons from the same struggle. The sharks glide through the murk, their cartilage frames bending with the currents, their teeth renewing quietly as they go. They have learned that power doesn't always come from armour or mass. Sometimes it comes from the ability to keep moving, to adapt, to wait. The Devonian seas are still busy, still full of motion and noise and experiment. But somewhere in the distance, faintly, the balance is shifting again. The jaws of metal and bone have reached their peak, and evolution is already preparing its next design, one that won't rely on weight or armour or brute force. One that will glide where others sink, feed where others starve, and survive long after the giants have vanished. The monsters still feed, their jaws clashing like living machinery in the depths. Yet just beyond their reach, the ocean's next rulers are practicing the art of patience. They have learned from the giants. They have watched how power rises and falls, and when the water grows dark and quiet again, they will still be there, waiting to inherit the silence left behind. The Devonian seas were not quiet. They only seem that way in memory, in the stillness of stone, where movement has long since gone. But when they were alive, they were crowded, restless, and filled with the friction of life pressing against life. The water was thick with bodies, fish in armour, fish without it, worms, mollusks, crustaceans, and early coral creatures forming towers that reached toward the dim light above. To drift through it would not have been peaceful. It would have been like moving through a dense forest where every branch breathed, every leaf watched, and every shadow hid a mouth. This was the world that evolved out of the first jaws and the first armour, a world that no longer belonged to passive feeders or drifting grazers. It belonged to those who had learned to attack, and those who had learned to endure it. The balance of nature was now defined not by abundance but by conflict. Each species that survived did so by finding a way to live within the tension. The oceans of armour and shadows were both magnificent and brutal, a place where strength had taken physical form and covered itself in plates of bone. Placoderms were everywhere. They were not all giants. Most were small, maybe the length of your arm, some even smaller. Their armour varied, from delicate overlapping plates that looked almost decorative to heavy fused shields that gave the appearance of a walking fortress. Each design spoke to a different way of life. Some placoderms grazed the seafloor, using their jaws to crush shells and sift through sand for nutrients. Others lurked near the reefs, waiting for smaller fish to swim too close. The largest, like Dunkleosteus, patrolled the open waters. Collectively, they filled the ocean like a single, massive organism with many forms. What defined them was not just their armour, but the way it divided their bodies. The front was encased in bone. The back remained flexible. It was a compromise between protection and movement, a living experiment in balance. For many millions of years, it worked flawlessly. Few animals could pierce their armour. The only real threat came from others like them, which meant that much of the predation in the Devonian was predator against predator. Armoured fish biting into armoured fish. It sounds like something from a nightmare, but to the creatures of that age, it was simply life. And yet, not everything in the sea wore armour. Alongside these plated hunters swam a growing number of unarmoured species, each carving out space where armour failed to reach. Sharks were among them, fast and lean, slipping through cracks in the hierarchy. They did not compete directly with the giants. They survived in the gaps between them. There were also early bony fish, the ancestors of the modern ray-finned species, developing lighter skeletons and smaller scales. Their advantage was speed. They could move where the armoured fish could not, darting into shallow lagoons or dense reefs. Over time, their numbers began to rise. Armour was protection, but it was also weight, and the oceans were slowly filling with creatures that preferred freedom to defence. Still, during the height of the Devonian, the armoured ones ruled. They formed the visible structure of marine life, shaping ecosystems through sheer presence. Their bones littered the seafloor when they died, creating habitats for other creatures. Their feeding patterns dictated where schools of smaller fish gathered and where they avoided. When a giant predator like Dunkleosteus swam through, everything else scattered. Even the water seemed to change character around them, as though the sea itself bent to their gravity. To exist in their world meant existing in constant awareness of power, its proximity, its noise, its reach. It's difficult for us to imagine how visually complex these oceans were. Light didn't travel far, and most of the deeper zones were shrouded in perpetual twilight. The upper waters shimmered with green and gold, lit by algae blooms that spread like clouds. Below, the light fractured into blue-grey haze. In this murky half-dark, shapes were more important than colours. Movement became the language of survival. A sudden flick of a tail could be the difference between life and death. The armoured predators used this to their advantage. Many had eyes set high on their skulls, adapted to detect silhouettes against the brighter water above. From below, they could watch for the faint outline of prey, rise silently and strike before being seen. The smaller fish responded by learning to hide in plain sight. Some developed counter-shading, dark on top, light underneath, to blend with both the seafloor and the surface glow. Others clustered in the schools where thousands of identical bodies moved together, confusing predators that relied on single targets. These strategies are still in use today, and they began in these Devonian seas. The ancient balance between hunter and hunted was already refining the same techniques that would persist for hundreds of millions of years. But the armour, for all its effectiveness, came with costs. To carry it required energy. To grow it required calcium and phosphorus from the water, which in turn depended on the health of the reefs and sediment cycles. When conditions shifted, when volcanic activity altered ocean chemistry, or when oxygen levels dipped, the armoured fish were the first to feel it. Their heavy bodies became liabilities. They could not travel far to find better water. They could not move fast enough to escape silted or stagnant zones. In contrast, unarmoured species like sharks could migrate freely, seeking new feeding grounds and cooler waters. It was a small advantage, but small advantages matter in the long run. In some parts of the Devonian world, particularly near the equator, the reefs were so vast they could have been seen from space if anyone had been there to look. These reefs were not like the coral structures we know today. They were built by different organisms, stromatoporoids, sponges and early corals that formed dense rock-like matrices. They served as both refuge and trap. Within their cracks and tunnels lived countless smaller creatures, from worm-like scavengers to crustaceans and primitive cephalopods. It was within these labyrinths that sharks and other agile predators found their sanctuary. The armoured hunters, too large and cumbersome to follow, circled outside like wolves around a warren, waiting for something to emerge. The deeper parts of these oceans were colder, darker, and stranger. Few creatures could survive there, but some did. Early jawless fish, remnants of older lineages, clung to existence in those depths. They were ghosts from an earlier age, overshadowed by the jawed predators that now ruled the shallows. Occasionally, one would drift upward and become a meal for a hungry placoderm or shark. Life below was sparse, but not absent. Even there, in the near dark, evolution continued its slow experimentation. It's tempting to see the Devonian seas as chaotic, but they were actually finely tuned systems. Every layer of the water column had its inhabitants, every niche filled. The reef supported herbivores and filter feeders, which supported small predators, which fed the large ones. When one population declined, the rest adjusted. The oceans were resilient, but they were also dependent on stability. That stability, as it turned out, would not last forever. For now, though, the world was still balanced, and the armoured fish continued their long reign. Their dominance gave the Devonian its character, a time of biological arms races, of escalating strength, of creatures encased in bone. Even the smallest species seemed to reflect that design ethos. Shells thickened, scales grew harder, defensive spines became common. It was as if evolution had collectively agreed that the answer to everything was armour, and for a while it was. Sharks living among them adapted in quieter ways. They became faster, leaner, and more aware of vibration and scent. Instead of thick skin, they developed dermal denticles, tiny tooth-like scales that protected their bodies without adding weight. They didn't need armour to survive. They needed awareness. Their entire anatomy was tuned to detect movement, to feel disturbances, to predict danger before it arrived. This sensitivity, developed in an age ruled by armoured giants, would become the foundation of their success long after those giants vanished. Even as the sharks adapted, the armoured predators continued to evolve in their own direction. Some developed flattened bodies for hunting along the seabed. Others grew massive, with jaws strong enough to crack shells the size of helmets. Fossil evidence shows bite marks on thick-shelled invertebrates, evidence of precision rather than brute force. These were not mindless creatures. They were efficient, methodical, and specialized. Each one played a role in maintaining the balance of its ecosystem. Without them, smaller species might have overrun the reefs, consuming the very structures that supported them. The interaction between armour and agility defined everything about life in the Devonian. You could almost say it was the first true age of strategy and evolution. Every creature was either defending or outmanoeuvring, shielding or striking. The ocean itself became a chessboard where every move had consequences, and yet, for all their complexity, these systems were fragile. They depended on temperature, oxygen and chemistry, remaining within narrow bounds. The smallest geological disturbance could send ripples of extinction through the food chain. It's strange to think that an ocean filled with monsters could also be so delicate. Beneath the aggression and the armour, the Devonian seas were a network of dependencies. Coral growth regulated oxygen levels, algae controlled nutrient flow, small invertebrates recycled waste into food. When the balance worked, life flourished on a scale the planet had never seen before. But when it faltered, entire ecosystems collapsed. The same armour that protected individuals could not protect the whole system. If you were to stand on one of the primitive landmasses then, on a coastline covered in early ferns and moss, you might have looked out over the water and seen none of this. The surface would have been calm, a soft blue-green shimmer stretching toward the horizon. Beneath that calm, however, was motion upon motion, armoured hunters circling, sharks weaving between them, smaller fish fleeing through coral, and the constant hum of life adapting. The Devonian Ocean was beautiful in the way that a storm is beautiful. Not peaceful, but full of energy, full of potential. As the eons passed, these armoured worlds began to show signs of strain. Environmental shifts started changing ocean chemistry. Volcanic eruptions released gases that altered the atmosphere. Algae blooms spread, then died off, pulling oxygen from the water as they decayed. Reefs suffered, and with them, the creatures that depended on them. The giants of the sea were among the first to feel it. They needed stability, abundant prey, and oxygen-rich waters. When those things began to vanish, their numbers fell. The smaller species fared better. Sharks, in particular, thrived in the transitional chaos. They could live in waters that would have suffocated the armoured fish. They could travel far to find new hunting grounds. Flexibility, once a minor advantage, was becoming the deciding factor. Even then, the change wasn't sudden. The oceans don't break overnight. They shift, they breathe, they change shape over generations. For millions of years, the Devonian seas continued their slow transformations, giving rise to new species even as others vanished. The shadows of the armoured hunters still passed overhead, but fewer of them each century. The reefs began to open up, creating new spaces for smaller creatures to explore. The balance was tipping quietly and gradually towards something new. And yet, even in decline, the armoured fish remained magnificent. Their fossils still tell the story of a time when life wore its strength on the outside, when survival meant building a fortress around the body. Their bones are heavy, intricate, and beautifully preserved, as if the earth itself admired their design enough to keep it intact. To look at one now is to see both the height of an era and the beginning of its end. They were the masters of a world built on armour, but the ocean was already learning to favour shadows instead. The seas of the Devonian were, in every sense, full of both. Armour for defence, shadow for escape. Bone for strength, cartilage for movement. The balance between them was never stable. It only appeared that way from a distance. Beneath the surface, change was constant. The armoured ones had ruled for millions of years, but the future belonged to the swift, the sensitive, and the adaptable. And somewhere in the currents, the first hints of that future were already gliding silently, unnoticed among the giants, ready to inherit the sea once it became quiet again. The water still held the reflection of those plated kings, the light catching on their surfaces like metal under sun. But deeper down, the light didn't reach. There, in the places the armoured fish could not follow, something else was waiting. It had no plates, no shields, no fortress of bone, only movement, precision, and patience. The oceans of armour and shadows were about to tilt toward the latter, though no one swimming in them could yet see it coming. The sea never announces change. It simply keeps moving, and everything within it must move with it. For millions of years, sharks had lived as quiet survivors in the shadow of armoured giants. They were small, fast and cautious, moving through the gaps in an ocean ruled by things that could crush them without effort. They learned to stay near the reefs, to hide in murky shallows, to hunt when the waters grew still. Theirs was a reign of endurance rather than conquest. But evolution does not leave endurance alone forever. It rewards it, strengthens it, and, given enough time, turns the patient survivor into something capable of more. The moment came when sharks stopped being the hunted and began to hunt back. This change didn't happen all at once. It took millions of years, and it didn't begin with a single mutation or a single species. It began with the quiet accumulation of advantages, the kind that go unnoticed until they start to matter. The earlier sharks of the Devonian had small, smooth scales that reduced drag and let them move almost silently. Their skeletons, made of cartilage, allowed their bodies to flex and twist with remarkable agility. Their senses, already keen, began to sharpen further. Every vibration in the water, every flicker of light, every trace of chemical change became information they could use. In a world where armour had been the answer to survival, sharks were becoming something entirely different. Organisms built not to resist force but to avoid it entirely. They were not yet the apex predators of the sea, but they were learning the skills that would make them so. They learned how to follow scent trails for miles, how to ambush rather than chase, and how to feed efficiently enough to conserve energy in leaner times. Their entire anatomy was becoming a response to the challenge of living among creatures far stronger than themselves, and eventually those responses became weapons. The same speed that once kept them alive became the speed that made them deadly. The same caution that once kept them hidden became precision. Slowly, imperceptibly, the balance began to shift. The Devonian period was full of creatures that depended on armour for protection. Placoderms were the pinnacle of that design philosophy, and for a long time it worked. Their heavy bone plates made them nearly invincible to anything smaller. But nature has a way of finding weak points. Armour can only protect what it covers, and joints, those places where plates meet and bend, were often exposed. Sharks, smaller and faster, began to exploit those weaknesses. Their teeth, though still relatively simple in form, were perfect for quick strikes. A shark didn't need to pierce through an armoured plate. It needed only to attack from the right angle, at the right moment, and take what it could before slipping away. Fossil evidence suggests that some sharks of this era, such as cladocelaceae, were already capable of attacking larger prey, including armoured fish. Bite marks on placoderm fossils show shallow curved incisions consistent with shark teeth, located near soft tissue areas like gill openings or tail fins. These were not random injuries. They were targeted strikes aimed at disabling, not overpowering. The early sharks were learning to fight not with strength but with strategy. In a sense, they were rewriting the rules that had governed oceanic life for tens of millions of years. The placoderms, meanwhile, continued their mechanical perfection. Their jaws grew stronger, their armour more refined. But these improvements came at a cost. Heavier armour meant slower swimming, and slower swimming meant fewer chances to feed. The large predators, like Dunkleosteus, needed vast amounts of food to sustain themselves, and as prey species declined, their dominance began to waver. Sharks, lighter and more flexible, began to thrive in the gaps left behind. They could eat a wider variety of food, small fish, carrion, even invertebrates, and could survive in conditions that would have suffocated their armoured rivals. For the first time, the advantage began to tilt away from armour and toward agility. The idea of sharks fighting back might sound dramatic, but in the language of evolution, fighting rarely means confrontation. It means adaptation. Sharks did not challenge the armoured fish in open battle. They simply outlasted them by changing faster. When the seas grew unstable, when oxygen levels fluctuated and habitats collapsed, sharks moved with the currents. They found new breeding grounds, new food sources, new ways to endure. Every generation that survived was a little faster, a little sharper, a little more aware. Some species began to develop specialized teeth, blades for slicing rather than holding, serrated edges for cutting through flesh instead of scraping it. This shift in dentition marked a turning point in their evolution. It meant that sharks were no longer content to scavenge or feed on small prey. They were adapting to kill efficiently. Their streamlined bodies, combined with these new tools, gave them an unprecedented versatility. They could hunt alone or in loose groups, attack from below or behind, strike and retreat before a slower creature could respond. The ocean had never seen anything like them before. As the Devonian neared its end, the world above the water was also changing. Forests were spreading across the continents, releasing oxygen to the air and altering global climates. The weather grew more variable, sea levels shifted, and the chemistry of the oceans changed with it. The vast coral reefs that had supported so much life began to die. With them went countless species that depended on their structures for food and shelter. The armoured hunters, once the undisputed rulers of the sea, began to decline. But the sharks, as they had always done, adapted. Without reefs to anchor their ecosystems, the oceans became open spaces once again, vast, unpredictable, and dangerous. In this new environment, armour was less useful than mobility. Speed became the new measure of survival. Sharks, born from generations of pressure and fear, were perfectly suited to the task. They could roam enormous distances, feeding opportunistically as they went. They became the ultimate generalist in a time when specialization was failing. One of the key evolutionary developments that helped them during this period was the refinement of their sensory systems. Sharks' ability to detect electrical fields, a feature that modern species still possess, likely had its roots here. Tiny pores along their snouts, filled with gel-like material, could sense the faint electrical impulses produced by muscle movement in nearby creatures. This meant they could hunt in total darkness, guided only by the invisible signals of life around them. In the murky waters of a dying reef system, that sense would have been invaluable. Their other senses were no less impressive. The lateral line, a system of pressure-sensitive cells running along their sides, could detect vibrations and turbulence in the water. A shark could feel a creature swimming hundreds of meters away, even if it couldn't see it, combined with an acute sense of smell, capable of detecting a single drop of blood in thousands of gallons of water. These adaptations made them extraordinarily aware of their surroundings. The armoured fish might have ruled by strength, but the sharks were learning to rule by information. The shift from prey to predator was not just biological, it was ecological. As the larger placoderms began to disappear, sharks filled the empty roles they left behind. They grew larger, diversified into new forms, and began to dominate the food chains of the late Devonian and early Carboniferous periods. Fossil evidence shows that by around 360 million years ago, sharks had become some of the most successful predators in the ocean. They no longer needed to hide. They had become the new standard for what it meant to be powerful. Still, the transition wasn't absolute. For a time, both groups coexisted. Armoured fish and sharks, strength and speed, bone and cartilage sharing the same sea. The battles between them continued, though now the outcome was less certain. A large placoderm could still crush a shark with a single bite, but it had to catch it first. And catching a shark was no easy task. The open ocean favoured those who could move fast and strike with precision, not those who carried a fortress on their backs. The slow, armoured giants were creatures of a fading world, and evolution was already preparing to replace them. The fossil record captures the aftermath of this long struggle better than the struggle itself. We see the decline of placoderm species toward the end of the Devonian, followed by a rapid diversification of sharks and early bony fish in the periods that followed. The sharks that survived were small, flexible, and perfectly adapted to a world in flux. Their victory was not a conquest, it was a survival strategy that became permanent. And yet, calling it victory feels almost too simple. Evolution has no winners, only survivors. The sharks didn't set out to overthrow the armoured fish. They simply continued doing what they had always done: adapt, wait, and endure. When the seas grew shallow, they adjusted. When food grew scarce, they changed diet. When predators grew too large, they hid. And when those predators vanished, they moved into the space that was left. The ocean rewards that kind of persistence. It always has. By the early Carboniferous, sharks had spread across nearly every marine environment, from shallow coastal waters to deep offshore zones. Some had evolved into forms we would recognise today, sleek and torpedo-shaped, with sharp triangular teeth and crescent tails designed for constant motion. Others took on stranger forms, with long spines or flat bodies adapted for life on the seafloor. They had become the most versatile vertebrates in the ocean, capable of thriving where others could not. The age of armour was ending. The seas that had once been dominated by plated giants were now filled with swimmers built for motion. The predators of the New World were not defined by their weight, but by their awareness. Where the placoderms had relied on physical protection, the sharks relied on intelligence. They read the water like a language, sensed movement before it happened, and struck where others were blind. They were not the biggest creatures in the ocean anymore, but they were the most effective. It's easy, from our vantage point, to see this as inevitable, as though the sharks were destined to rise while the armoured fish were destined to fall. But evolution has no script. The world could have turned out differently if the environment had stayed stable. The placoderms might have continued refining their armour, developing lighter forms or new strategies. But the world didn't stay stable. The Devonian ended in a series of extinction events that wiped out much of marine life. In the vacuum that followed, the survivors were not the strongest but the most adaptable. The sharks fit that description perfectly. Even today, they carry the memory of that age in their design. Their bodies are streamlined for perpetual movement. Their skeletons remain cartilaginous, light and flexible. Their senses are tuned to detect the faintest traces of life in the water. Every part of them reflects lessons learned during those long ages when they lived beneath monsters and learned how to outthink them. The ocean has changed beyond recognition since then, but the logic of survival remains the same. If you could dive back into those last Devonian seas, you would see both endings and beginnings happening at once. The armoured hunters still drift through the depths, fewer than before but no less imposing. Their shadows move slowly over the seafloor. In the distance, smaller shapes dart between them, slender, restless, alive with intent. A plecoderm opens its jaws in a final act of dominance, but the strike misses. The shark is already gone, its body bending effortlessly through the current, leaving only a trail of disturbed silt behind. The balance that once seemed eternal has shifted forever, and still, the ocean continues. The tides roll, the reefs breathe, the water hums with life adapting to its next challenge. Sharks, having survived the fall of giants, now swim freely through the spaces once filled by armour. They are not yet the masters of the sea, but they are its future. Their time has come, not through conquest or violence, but through the quiet triumph of endurance. The Devonian is nearing its end, and with it, the age of bone and metal begins to fade. The oceans are changing shape again, and the survivors will change with them. Somewhere beneath the surface, unseen, evolution continues its work, slow, patient, and relentless. The sharks that once fled are now the hunters, and the world they inherit will never be the same. The Devonian world did not collapse with noise or sudden ruin. It began to change quietly, almost politely at first, the way climates and ecosystems often do, by drifting past thresholds no creature could recognize in time. What had once been the planet's golden age of fish was starting to fray at its edges. The seas were full of life, but that life had grown too heavy, too dependent on stability that was never meant to last. The ocean had given rise to armour and jaws, to creatures of astonishing complexity, but now it was beginning to take them back. The continents were moving again. Massive tectonic shifts pushed land masses toward each other, closing the gaps that had once been broad, warm seas. As they collided, mountains rose and coastlines changed shape. Rivers altered their courses. Shallow waters, the nurseries of most marine life, began to drain or close off from the open ocean. Vast reef systems, once stretching across entire continents, found themselves trapped in shrinking basins. In those isolated waters, temperatures fluctuated, oxygen levels dropped, and ecosystems that had thrived for tens of millions of years began to falter. To the creatures living through it, the change would not have seemed sudden. A single generation of fish might have noticed that the water was murkier, that food was harder to find, that the seasons were slightly different. Another generation later, certain hunting grounds might have vanished entirely. The reefs that had been dense cities of coral and sponges turned into wastelands of silt and decay. Life continued, but in smaller and smaller pockets, and the spaces between them grew wider. The great armoured predators built for a world of plenty were among the first to suffer. They needed vast amounts of food to sustain their massive bodies. When prey grew scarce, they starved quickly. The smaller, more flexible species, especially the sharks, could endure longer. They ate what they could find, travelled farther in search of food, and adapted to the changing chemistry of the water. Evolution had prepared them for scarcity by making them efficient. The same qualities that once made them vulnerable to the giants now allowed them to survive their absence. The environmental changes of the late Devonian were complex and overlapping. Volcanic eruptions released clouds of ash and gas that settled over the oceans, altering the balance of carbon and oxygen. Some regions experienced what scientists call anoxic events, periods when oxygen levels in the water dropped so low that most marine life suffocated. In the sediments left behind, we can still see the evidence. Dark, organic, rich layers marking the times when the seas went still, when entire ecosystems died and fell to the bottom together. It wasn't one event, but several, stretched over millions of years. Each wave of extinction was followed by partial recovery, then another collapse. The first struck the reef systems, wiping out the coral builders that had shaped marine habitats for eons. The second hit open water species, including many of the large predators. The third and most severe came near the end of the Devonian, around 359 million years ago, when as much as 75% of marine species vanished. It was one of the planet's great resets, though it unfolded so slowly that no individual creature would have known it was happening. In the shallows, the water grew cloudy with decay. Algae blooms spread as dead matter decomposed, feeding new growths that further depleted oxygen. Whole regions of the ocean became uninhabitable, forcing species to migrate or die. The placoderms, once the dominant hunters of the sea, could not keep pace with this changing world. Their armour, which had protected them from every living threat, could not protect them from the environment itself. Their bodies were too heavy to survive in low-oxygen water. Their reproductive cycles were too slow to recover from population crashes. Bit by bit, they disappeared from the fossil record. The sharks, by contrast, seemed almost built for this moment. Their light skeletons required less oxygen. Their reproductive strategies, whether laying tough, leathery eggs or giving birth to live young, ensured that at least some offspring survived even in harsh conditions. They were opportunists, able to feed on almost anything, and as their competition dwindled, they spread into every corner of the sea. It wasn't dominance through conquest, it was dominance through persistence. But this was not just a story of decline, it was also a story of transformation. While the ocean struggled, the land above them was becoming something new. The Devonian saw the rise of forests, real forests, with roots, leaves, and trunks that reached high into the air. Plants that had once hugged the ground began to tower, spreading across continents and changing the chemistry of the atmosphere. Their roots broke apart rocks, releasing minerals into rivers that washed into the sea. The influx of nutrients fueled massive algal blooms, which further disrupted marine oxygen levels. What began as a quiet greening of the land became one of the most significant environmental shifts in Earth's history. The forests also drew carbon dioxide out of the air, cooling the planet. As global temperatures fell, glaciers formed near the poles and sea levels dropped. Entire shallow seas dried up, taking with them the habitats that had nurtured the Devonian explosion of life. It was as though the Earth itself had decided to rebalance its systems, trading the chaos of warmth and abundance for the austerity of cold and scarcity. The creatures of the ocean had no say in the matter. They simply adapted, or didn't. The late Devonian was, in many ways, a test of flexibility. Species that could adjust quickly, whether through migration, reproduction, or metabolic efficiency, survived. Those that depended on stability vanished. The pattern is familiar to us now, seen again and again throughout the history of life. But in this moment, it was happening for the first time on such a scale. It was a rehearsal for every extinction that would follow. To imagine it is to picture an ocean caught between two worlds. In one, remnants of the old order still glide through the depths, placoderms armoured in bone, relics of an age when strength was everything. In the other, the new order is already emerging, sleek sharks and nimble bony fish, unarmoured but quick, darting through the ruins of coral cities that no longer grow. The water itself is the dividing line between them, a medium of transition. It is still blue and full of motion, but underneath, it carries the chemical signals of change, slightly more acidic, slightly less breathable, slightly less forgiving. The extinction events that reshaped the Devonian oceans were not acts of destruction so much as acts of clearing. They stripped away the overgrown systems that had reached their limits, making room for new forms of life. The fall of the armoured fish opened niches that had never existed before. Sharks moved into some of them, and early bony fish into others. Together, they would go on to define the marine ecosystems of the next 350 million years. But for those living through it, there was no sense of renewal, only loss. The reefs, once teeming with life, became graveyards. The water turned black in places from decaying matter. Predators grew fewer, prey scattered, and the great web of marine relationships unravelled. It's difficult to imagine the scale of silence that followed. The seas that had once thundered with movement became still. Fossil layers from this period show long stretches of sediment with almost no remains, as though life itself had paused. And yet, even in that stillness, some things continued. Tiny, resilient creatures, plankton, algae, small crustaceans, persisted. Their survival was enough. Life has a way of keeping its foothold, even when the rest falls away. In time, the balance would rebuild itself layer by layer. The sharks, more than any other large animal of their time, were positioned to take advantage of that recovery. They were among the first to repopulate the open seas once oxygen returned, and they diversified rapidly in the wake of the collapse. From their Devonian ancestors came a variety of new species, each better suited to the leaner, colder world that followed. It's easy to see this as an inevitable passing of eras, but the reality is less tidy. The extinction that ended the Devonian was chaotic, patchy, and drawn out. Some regions suffered total collapse, others recovered quickly. In certain parts of the world, remnants of placoderm species lingered for a while longer, isolated in pockets of stability. They were the last echoes of a vanished age, holding on as long as the water allowed. But evolution had already moved on. The next generation of predators, the sharks, the early ray-finned fish, and the first amphibians venturing onto land were writing new rules. The world on the brink of change was not just losing species, it was changing its very structure. The composition of the atmosphere shifted as plants altered the carbon cycle. The texture of the land changed as roots stabilized soil and slowed erosion. The rhythm of the tides changed as the continents continued to move. Even the colour of the oceans may have deepened, tinted by the altered chemistry of their contents. Every part of the planet was adjusting, connected through invisible feedback loops that no creature could see but all would feel. In this context, the story of sharks is more than a tale of survival. It is a case study in the value of simplicity. Their bodies had fewer moving parts, fewer dependencies, and fewer weaknesses. Where other species evolved elaborate armour or complex physiology, sharks relied on basic principles: flexibility, efficiency, awareness. These traits, honed by millions of years of living under threat, became the foundation of their resilience. When the world changed, they didn't need to reinvent themselves. They were already built for uncertainty. The Devonian extinction was one of the planet's most transformative crises, but it was also an opportunity. The fall of the armoured fish cleared the way for new forms of vertebrates, including those that would one day walk on land. Some of the lobe-finned fish that survived this period carried within them the genetic potential for legs, lungs, and terrestrial life. The story of sharks cannot be separated from that of these other pioneers. Together, they represent the twin paths that life took after the Devonian, one that stayed in the water and perfected the art of swimming, and one that crawled onto land and began to breathe air. For the sharks, the path forward was clear. The oceans were emptier now, but emptiness can be an advantage. They filled the void, expanding into every depth and temperature, every coastline and current. Over the next few million years, they would diversify into an astonishing array of forms, some small and delicate, others massive and predatory. The extinction had not destroyed them, it had set them free. If you could look at the Earth from orbit then, you would see a planet still reeling from change. The continents were shifting, their surfaces greening with new forests. The poles glittered with the first real ice caps in millions of years. The oceans, though still vast, were quieter. Their colour was darker, their life more scattered. But somewhere in that stillness, movement remained. Small, fast, deliberate. Sharks cutting through the water with the same grace they have today. Survivors of one world already adapting to the next. And beneath them, buried in the silt of vanished reefs, lay the bones of those that came before. The armoured hunters, the reef builders, the giants who once ruled the seas. Their era was over, but their legacy remained, written in every adaptation that followed. The ocean had tested them and moved on, as it always does. The world had changed, but life, somehow, had not forgotten how to begin again. The water was different now, colder, thinner, harder to breathe, but still alive. The sharks swam through it as if they had always belonged, their bodies remembering a million small adjustments that had brought them here. They were no longer shadows in another creature's world. They were the architects of their own survival, the first of a new order that would stretch far beyond the Devonian. And as the planet turned and the ice spread and the oxygen fell and rose again, they kept swimming. The world was on the brink of change, but the sharks had already crossed it. By the time the end came, the world had already begun to empty itself. The great armoured hunters that once filled the Devonian seas were fewer now, scattered and hungry, moving through water that no longer provided what it once did. The reefs that had supported entire ecosystems were gone, replaced by stretches of barren seabed covered in sediment and the remains of what had once thrived there. The water carried the scent of decay, organic matter breaking down faster than it could be renewed. To the creatures that still lived, it must have felt like the ocean itself was tiring, exhaling slowly and deeply as it slipped into a long, uneasy sleep. The giants did not vanish in a single catastrophic moment. There was no explosion, no sudden silence, no instant end. They faded. The decline came in waves, local collapses, recoveries, and collapses again, each one weaker than the last. For millions of years, life struggled to maintain the balance it had once taken for granted. Some species clung to existence in isolated habitats, surviving for generations before disappearing completely. Others adapted for a while, shrinking in size or changing diet, trying to match the pace of a shifting planet. But the oceans were no longer the same world that had created them. The chemistry, the temperature, the oxygen, the food chains, everything had changed. The age of armour was dissolving piece by piece. The placoderms were the first to feel it. They had dominated the seas for over 50 million years, but their success had made them rigid. Their armour, once their greatest advantage, became a weight they could no longer afford. As oxygen levels in the oceans dropped, their heavy bodies demanded more than the environment could give. They needed stable ecosystems, high-energy prey, and open, oxygen-rich water. The Devonian seas offered none of these anymore. The world that had once rewarded size and strength now punished it. The largest of them, the Dunkleosteus, had ruled the open waters as an apex predator. Its bite was unmatched, its armour impenetrable, its presence unchallenged. But even such perfection could not survive a starving world. The reefs were dead, and the smaller fish that had once filled the mid-level ecosystems were gone. Without them, there was nothing left to feed on. A creature built for constant motion, constant hunting, cannot last long when every pursuit leads to emptiness. Fossil evidence shows that the last of the Dunkleosteus species grew smaller with time, a common sign of environmental stress. It was evolution's way of trying to keep them alive by making them need less. But the process came too late. The smaller placoderms lasted a little longer. Some, like Bothrialepis, were not predators, but bottom feeders, using their jaws to sift through sediment for organic matter. For a time, this lifestyle protected them. They could survive on less, and they lived in environments where predators were rare. But when the water itself turned anoxic, deprived of oxygen, even these survivors had nowhere left to go. Their fossils are found in abundance in the upper Devonian rock layers, often preserved in thick clusters that suggest mass death events. Entire populations perished in single intervals of oxygen collapse, their bodies settling quietly on the seafloor to form the dark, carbon-rich bands that still mark the end of their kind. The extinction of the placoderms was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a chain reaction that reshaped the planet's biosphere. The loss of the reefs, triggered by changing ocean chemistry and falling sea levels, removed the foundation for most marine food webs. Coral and sponge communities that had been the nurseries of life vanished almost completely. Without them, the ocean's productivity collapsed. Algae and bacteria filled the void, but they could not support the same diversity of life. The giants starved, and the smaller creatures that fed on their waste disappeared with them. Meanwhile, the continents continued to shift. The collision of land masses created mountain ranges, which altered weather patterns and disrupted ocean circulation. Freshwater runoff carried nutrients and sediments into the seas, fueling blooms of algae that further depleted oxygen. Each new geological event added another layer to the crisis, another challenge to an already stressed ecosystem. It was as though the Earth itself had become restless, turning over and reshaping its own surface while the life upon it tried in vain to keep pace. The world that emerged from this turbulence was colder, harsher, and less forgiving. Sea levels dropped as glaciers expanded near the poles, exposing continental shelves that had once been underwater, shallow marine habitats. The heart of Devonian biodiversity became dry land. The creatures that depended on them vanished. Deep-sea environments remained, but they were nutrient-poor, isolated, and often oxygen deficient. Life retreated into the few places that could still sustain it. In this shrinking world, sharks became the quiet inheritors. They had never relied on reefs or specific ecosystems. Their adaptability allowed them to survive where the giants could not. Their light skeletons required little oxygen. Their opportunistic diets gave them flexibility. And their reproductive resilience ensured that even when populations fell, recovery was possible. Fossil evidence suggests that sharks not only survived the Devonian extinctions but diversified during them. While most species were dying out, sharks were beginning to evolve into new forms. It's difficult to picture what those oceans looked like as the giants faded. They must have been emptier, quieter, darker. The constant motion that had defined the Devonian, schools of fish, towering coral, the slow drift of armoured hunters, gave way to stillness. The water was probably cloudy with debris, the seabed littered with the skeletons of the dead. In this silence, the few remaining creatures carried on, unaware that they were living through one of Earth's great transitions. Life doesn't notice when it is between eras. It only keeps moving. Some scientists believe that the late Devonian extinctions occurred in pulses, separated by hundreds of thousands of years. If so, there were times when life seemed to recover, when reefs began to grow again, and fish populations rebounded, only for another collapse to follow. To the creatures of the time, these fluctuations would have felt like seasons, good years and bad years, abundance followed by scarcity. But each collapse dug deeper until the system could no longer recover. By the end, nearly all the major reef-building organisms were gone, along with most of the large fish. The oceans had been reset to a simpler state, and yet, even in their decline, the armoured giants left behind something of themselves. Their bones became part of the geological record, their remains adding minerals to the sediments that would form new rocks, new soil, and eventually new life. Evolution never erases completely. It recycles. The calcium that once formed the plates of a placoderm might one day form the shell of a mollusk or the skeleton of a mammal. The materials remain, only the forms change. The extinction that ended the Devonian was one of the longest in Earth's history, stretching over millions of years. It lacked the drama of later events like the one that ended the dinosaurs, but its effects were just as profound. It removed the dominant lineages of the time and paved the way for new ones. In its aftermath, the planet entered a quieter, more subdued phase. The Carboniferous period would follow, bringing with it lush forests, giant insects, and the first true amphibians. The oceans, though less spectacular than before, became more stable, dominated by sharks and bony fish rather than armoured giants. From the perspective of deep time, this transition looks almost gentle, a natural turnover, one age giving way to another. But for the creatures living through it, it was extinction in slow motion. Each species reached its final generation unaware that it was the last. Each adaptation, once so effective, became irrelevant in a changing world. Evolution doesn't mourn, but the Earth records loss in its own way, in the layers of sediment that preserve the outlines of vanished lives. It's tempting to think of extinction as an ending, but it is also a beginning. When the giants faded, they left behind a vacuum, and nature does not tolerate emptiness. Within a few million years, new predators rose to fill their roles. Sharks became larger and more diverse, their streamlined forms perfected through the pressures of survival. Bony fish evolved new strategies for feeding and reproduction. The ocean recovered, not by returning to what it had been, but by becoming something entirely new. Still, for a time, there must have been a strange, eerie calm. The giants that had once ruled the seas were gone, their shadows no longer moving across the reefs, their armoured bodies no longer stirring the water. The silence they left behind was the sound of transition, a pause between the heavy breath of one world and the first heartbeat of another. If you could drift through those waters then, you might have seen the last of them. A lone placoderm, smaller than its ancestors, gliding through a fading reef, searching for food that was no longer there, its armour dull from age, its movements slow, its body carrying the weight of a lineage that had lasted tens of millions of years. Around it, the water would have been empty. No rivals, no prey, only the faint sound of current moving through a dying world. And somewhere beyond the haze, a shape passes. A shark, quick, light, unarmoured. The placoderm turns, slow to react, as the smaller predator slips past, silent and effortless, a reminder of the new order to come. The day the giants faded was not marked by fire or impact. It was marked by stillness. It was marked by the gradual erasure of abundance, the quiet retreat of forms that had once defined the ocean. But it was also marked by continuity, by the persistence of life that refused to stop. The world did not end. It changed its rhythm. In time, the reefs would rebuild, different but alive. New species would rise, learn and fall again, each carrying fragments of the past within them. The sharks would inherit the sea, not as conquerors, but as custodians of everything that survived. The armour of the placoderms would rust into memory, their names reduced to fossils and shapes in stone. But the principles they embodied, strength, adaptation, resilience, would live on, transformed into new designs, new strategies, new lives. The giants are gone now, their bones settle deep beneath layers of sediment, but the ocean still remembers them. It remembers in the silence between currents, in the structure of jaws that still close with mechanical precision, in the shadows that move with the same cautious grace as those first armoured fish. The water never forgets. It carries everything forward, reshaping, reusing, and rebuilding in an endless cycle. The day the giants faded was not a single day at all. It was a long twilight stretched across millions of years, during which the ocean traded power for flexibility, grandeur for endurance. And in that twilight the survivors emerged, smaller, faster, wiser. The sharks had watched the rise and fall of titans and learned the most important lesson evolution ever teaches. Nothing stays the same, and survival belongs to those who can live with change. The water was cooler now, the continents heavier, the reefs silent. The world was quieter, but not empty. Movement continued, small and certain. The giants were gone, but life remained, waiting for its next chance to grow. And in the stillness that followed, The ocean exhaled, ready to begin again. After the giants faded, the oceans grew quiet again. Not dead, but quiet. The constant churn of armoured predators, the endless noise of feeding and pursuit, the sound of reefs crackling with life, all of it was replaced by something thinner, something sparse. The Devonian seas had burned bright, but that brightness had cost them their balance. What remained was a planet exhaling after exhaustion, its ecosystems stripped down to the bare essentials. And in that silence, new life began to rebuild itself. It's strange to think of extinction as an opportunity, but that is what it becomes every time. When one world collapses, another begins forming out of its ruins. After the placoderms were gone, after the reefs were reduced to rubble, after the deep waters turned cold and still, there were spaces everywhere, empty ecological rooms waiting for new tenants. The survivors were few, but they were varied. Small, adaptable creatures, those that had weathered the collapse by needing little, were the first to return. And among them, gliding silently through the recovering seas, were the sharks. They had outlasted the armoured hunters not through superiority, but through flexibility. Their bodies had remained simple when others had grown complex, their diets wide when others had specialised. They could live where oxygen was scarce, feed when prey was rare, and move when the currents changed. They were not the architects of this new age, but they were its inheritors, ready to occupy every open niche that the extinction had left behind. The Carboniferous period followed, bringing with it a new Earth. The continents were greener than they had ever been. Forests of towering ferns and club mosses covered the land, their roots weaving deep into the soil. The air grew heavy with oxygen, thicker than before, and the climate stabilized for a time. Rain fell in long, steady sheets, filling rivers and lakes that connected to the recovering oceans. The seas themselves were different now, cooler, clearer and deeper. The coral reefs that had collapsed began to rebuild, this time with new species of coral and sponges. The food chains grew back layer by layer. Plankton returned first, followed by small fish, then the predators that hunted them. In this new ocean, sharks found themselves without rivals. The extinction had erased the great armoured placoderms and weakened many other ancient lineages. What remained was a wide-open evolutionary landscape, and sharks spread into it with quiet efficiency. Some stayed small, patrolling coastal shallows. Others grew larger, filling the role of apex predators that had once belonged to the giants. Within a few million years, they were among the most diverse groups of animals in the sea. Their reign, once quiet and cautious, had become complete. The fossil record from this period shows an explosion of shark forms. There were species with elongated fins, species with flattened bodies for bottom dwelling, and species with long, curving spines that may have been used for defense or display. Some developed specialized teeth for grinding shells, others for slicing through flesh. Each adaptation was an answer to a specific challenge in a recovering world. Evolution, freed from the constraints of old ecosystems, began experimenting again. The results were both strange and beautiful. One of the most remarkable sharks of this new age was Falcatus, a small species that lived around 325 million years ago. The males of Falcatus had long, sickle-shaped spines projecting from their heads, structures that may have been used in mating rituals or as defensive tools. Another, Stethocanthus, had a curious anvil-shaped structure on its back, covered in tiny scales arranged like a rough surface. Scientists still debate its purpose. It may have been used for attracting mates, or perhaps for sensory perception, or even to anchor muscles for powerful swimming. Whatever the reason, it demonstrates how freely evolution was experimenting with design, now that the old order was gone. There was also Helicoprion, a later descendant whose jaw carried a spiral of continuously growing teeth, coiled like a circular saw inside its mouth. Its exact function remains a topic of fascination. Some believe it helped slice soft-bodied prey, others that it acted like a rolling trap to hold food in place. Whatever its role, it shows how sharks, once conservative survivors, had become innovators. In a world without competition, creativity became the new form of strength. While the sharks flourished, other survivors were adapting in their own ways. The first true bony fish, ancestors of almost every modern fish species, began to diversify rapidly. Their skeletons, made of lightweight bone rather than cartilage, allowed for even more variation in shape and size. Some evolved complex fins that gave them fine control in movement, letting them navigate dense vegetation and shallow lagoons. Others developed new feeding mechanisms, using suction and rapid jaw movements to catch prey. The sharks shared the oceans with them, sometimes as rivals, sometimes as hunters, sometimes as hunted. The balance that had collapsed at the end of the Devonian was returning, though now it was built on different foundations. For the first time, the oceans began to resemble something like the ones we know today, dynamic, layered, and full of interdependent life. Schools of small fish moved in coordinated motion, hunted by sleek predators from below. Coral reefs began to hum again with colour and activity. The sea floor teemed with invertebrates, crinoids, and early shellfish. The food chains were simpler than before but stable. Stability, after the chaos of extinction, was its own form of abundance. The sharks thrived in this new rhythm. Their sensory systems, honed during the desperate centuries of survival, gave them dominance in every environment. They could sense prey hidden beneath sand, detect faint electric pulses from buried creatures, and smell chemical traces carried miles by the current. They became not just hunters but regulators, keeping populations in balance, preventing the overcrowding that had once destroyed the reefs of the Devonian. They were not aware of their role, of course. They were simply being what they had always been, opportunists moving in response to the flow of life around them, but their presence helped shape the new ecosystems, guiding them toward equilibrium. This was not an age of giants anymore. The creatures of the Carboniferous were smaller, more efficient, more complex in behaviour. Size was no longer the measure of power, adaptability was. Evolution had learned from the Devonian's excess. It had seen what happened when organisms grew too large, too specialised, too dependent on stability. Now it favoured moderation. Life had discovered the strength of flexibility. Above the water, the land was changing just as profoundly. The dense forests that covered the continents created vast deposits of organic matter, which over millions of years would become coal. The increased oxygen levels in the atmosphere allowed animals to grow larger than before, and the first insects of enormous size appeared. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than a human arm, millipedes as long as a person is tall, amphibians, descended from the lobe-finned fish that had survived the Devonian extinction, ventured farther from the water, breathing air through lungs that had once been gills. The earth was inventing new kinds of life, and the oceans were no longer the only stage for complexity. Yet even as land became more diverse, the sea remained the planet's heart. The majority of life still pulsed through its currents, and the sharks were its steady rhythm. Their success was not dramatic. It was quiet, consistent, and enduring. They were never the most numerous creatures, but they were among the most stable. Their design had reached a kind of equilibrium, simple enough to be efficient, sophisticated enough to persist. It's why, even today, a modern shark's body plan is almost identical to those that swam hundreds of millions of years ago. When evolution finds a solution that works, it rarely replaces it. The Carboniferous seas were cooler than the Devonian ones, and oxygen levels fluctuated in new ways, but sharks adapted seamlessly. Their metabolic systems could handle variation, their reproductive strategies ensured resilience, and their senses kept them aware of every shift. They occupied every available niche: surface feeders, deep-sea hunters, reef dwellers, scavengers. Where one species faltered, another took its place. They had become the constant presence in an unpredictable ocean, even as new predators evolved. Bony fish with agile fins, early amphibians venturing into brackish water. The sharks maintained their position. They did not need to evolve rapidly anymore. The world was catching up to them, adjusting to the design they had perfected through necessity. Their bodies were not inventions of the Carboniferous. They were relics of the Devonian, refined through survival. They carried in their shape the memory of everything that had come before. The armoured giants, the collapsing reefs, the suffocating waters. Every curve, every muscle, every sensory pore was a record of endurance. It's easy to imagine this as a peaceful recovery, but it wasn't. The oceans were still volatile, their chemistry still changing, their inhabitants still competing. Extinction didn't end in a single moment. It continued in echoes, wiping out species that failed to adapt to the post-Devonian world. But compared to what had come before, the pace of loss slowed. The balance was fragile but real. The survivors had learned how to live within uncertainty, and that made all the difference. For the sharks, this period marked not just recovery but expansion. Their fossils appear in regions far from their original range, suggesting they spread across nearly all the world's oceans. Their diversity increased, their body sizes varied, their behaviours differentiated. Some began to specialise in open water hunting, others in ambush or scavenging. Each variation ensured that no single environmental change could wipe them out again. They had become evolution's insurance policy against the instability of the planet itself. The reefs that returned in the late Carboniferous were not the same as those of the Devonian. They were smaller, less ornate, but more durable. Built by different coral species and new symbiotic relationships, they reflected a world that had learned restraint. Life no longer expanded unchecked. It grew within limits, shaped by the memory of collapse. The sharks moved through these reefs like reminders of both past and future, their presence a continuation of the old rhythm under new rules. As millions of years passed, the descendants of these early sharks continued to adapt, slowly refining the features that would define their lineage. Their skeletons remained cartilaginous, but their teeth diversified into complex shapes. Some pointed for piercing, others serrated for cutting. Their reproductive strategies evolved to balance survival and population growth, ensuring that enough young would survive in a world where predators had become more efficient. They became the quiet backbone of marine life, as constant as the tides themselves. The age of the survivors was not a grand or glorious time. It was an age of rebuilding, of quiet endurance. The oceans were smaller, the ecosystems humbler, but they were stable. The chaos of the Devonian had given way to the steady pulse of recovery. Sharks had gone from living in fear to shaping the balance of the seas. The giants were gone, but the lessons they left behind endured in every fin that cut through the water, every set of teeth that renewed itself endlessly, every movement that measured strength not by mass but by precision. If you could swim through those Carboniferous waters, you would see a world that had found its footing again. The reefs shimmered softly with new life. Shoals of fish darted through beams of filtered light. Crinoids swayed gently on the seafloor, catching nutrients from passing currents, and among them, sharks moved with unhurried confidence. They were not many, but they were everywhere, silent, steady, and aware. The sea had been remade, and they had remade themselves along with it. The giants were a memory now, their bones part of the sediment beneath new generations. The ocean had learned to breathe again, slower but deeper, and in its breath moved the survivors, creatures that had endured not through strength, but through patience, awareness, and the ability to change. The world had proven once again that extinction is never the end, only the resetting of the stage. The sharks did not rule through power, they ruled through continuity. They were the thread that connected one age to the next, the embodiment of life's quiet persistence. The age of the survivors was their inheritance, and they carried it forward into a future that would test them again and again. But for now, the waters were calm, the balance restored, and the ocean had remembered how to live. And somewhere in the depths, in the still places untouched by sunlight, something new was always beginning. Life does not stop when it is quiet. It listens, it prepares, it waits for the next change. When the world finally settled after the long Devonian collapse, the bones of its lost empires remained behind, buried deep beneath layers of silt and time. The armoured fish that had once ruled the oceans were gone, but the earth had kept their memory, pressed into stone, waiting for someone to listen. For millions of years the sediment built up quietly, sand, mud, shells and dust falling over what was once flesh and armour, sealing it away. The sea forgot the creatures themselves, but the rock remembered. Fossils are the closest thing life has to a language of ghosts. They do not speak in sound, but in shape. A curve of jaw, a pattern of scales, the impression of a fin, each tells a fragment of a story too large for memory. In the case of the Devonian and its giants, that story is written across continents, scattered in fragments that scientists still piece together today. From cliffs in Morocco to quarries in Ohio, from riverbeds in Poland to deserts in Australia, the bones of the armoured fish emerge like whispers from another age. Each fossil carries the same quiet message. There was a time when strength meant armour, when the sea was filled with plated predators and jawed hunters that moved like living fortresses. But it also carries another message, softer and harder to miss, the truth that nothing, no matter how dominant, remains forever. The rocks do not lie, and they do not flatter. They record the rise and fall with equal precision, leaving no distinction between victory and extinction. The fossils of the placoderms are remarkable for their preservation. Their bony plates, thick and durable, fossilised far better than the cartilage skeletons of the sharks that replaced them. It's a small irony of history. The creatures that survived left less behind, while the ones that vanished became the most visible evidence of that world. The placoderm fossils we find today are often almost complete. Their armour still articulated, their jaws still locked mid-motion. Some are even preserved in what appear to be moments of struggle, predator and prey entangled forever, a snapshot of the instant before extinction. In museum displays, these fossils stand as monuments to an age when nature's experiments were still wild and unrefined. To look at one closely is to see both ingenuity and excess. The plates fit together like pieces of a puzzle, overlapping for flexibility, yet thick enough to resist force. The jaw mechanisms, though primitive compared to modern fish, show clear innovation, hinges, levers and ridges that allowed for powerful bites. They were, in every sense, prototypes of the future, a blueprint of what was to come. And yet they disappeared. Scientists can trace their fall in the fossil record with unsettling clarity. In Devonian rock layers, placoderm fossils are abundant, representing dozens of species in diverse forms, some massive, others small, some armoured head to tail, others only partially. But as the layers move upward, into younger stone, they thin. The diversity drops first, then the size, then the number. Finally they vanish altogether, replaced by the simpler outlines of sharks and bony fish. The transition is not sharp but gradual, a tapering line drawn over millions of years. It's the geological equivalent of a heartbeat slowing until it stops. The fossils tell us that extinction is rarely sudden. It unfolds slowly, invisibly, across generations. The last placoderm didn't know it was the last. It swam through water that must have felt normal, even as the chemistry around it changed, even as its prey grew scarce and its young failed to survive. The record it left behind doesn't show despair or struggle, just absence. The world continued, but without them. Some of the most detailed fossils from this period come from what were once coastal lagoons, places where the water was shallow and sediment accumulated quickly. These environments acted like natural archives, capturing each generation of creatures as the ocean advanced and retreated. In these rocks, scientists have uncovered not only placoderms, but early sharks, bony fish, and strange invertebrates that no longer exist. Each layer is a page in the slow book of deep time. In a few rare cases, we can even see the transition captured almost literally. Layers where the fossils of armoured fish disappear and the fossils of early sharks begin to dominate. It is not a battle scene, not a record of direct competition, but a quiet handover. One lineage fading into the stone while another begins to multiply above it. It's a strange thing to see, the geological equivalent of evolution changing the locks. The fossils also reveal something unexpected about those ancient seas. They were not all destroyed equally. Some regions show sharp declines, others show stability that lasted longer. This uneven pattern suggests that extinction is rarely universal. It's a mosaic, with survival determined by chance as much as adaptation. A population of sharks in one region might thrive while others vanish elsewhere. A species of armoured fish might cling to existence in a deep basin long after its relatives are gone. Even in death, diversity leaves fingerprints. One of the most haunting sights from this period lies in the Cleveland Shale of North America. Here, the remains of Dunkleosteus were found. Massive skulls with shearing jaws preserved in exquisite detail. The shale's fine-grained sediment captured even the smallest textures of their armour, allowing paleontologists to reconstruct their anatomy with astonishing accuracy. These fossils are so complete that scientists can estimate their muscle attachments and bite strength, revealing that Dunkleosteus could crush prey with a force exceeding 11,000 pounds per square inch. Yet the same layers that preserved them also mark their disappearance. Above the final Dunkleosteus fossils, the rock changes character. Fewer bones, finer sediment, the signature of a dying ocean. Elsewhere, in the old red sandstone of Scotland, we find the fossils of Bothriollepis, a bottom-dwelling placoderm that once thrived in freshwater and coastal environments. Its remains are found in abundance in some layers, then suddenly in smaller and smaller numbers, until they too vanish. The sediment shifts from river deposits to barren sandstones, an environmental story written without words. These fossils don't just tell us what died, they tell us how. When paleontologists study these remains, they are not just cataloguing bones, they are reconstructing an entire world that no longer exists. Chemical analysis of fossilized bone can reveal the temperature and composition of ancient seawater. The isotopic ratios in sediment can indicate oxygen levels, carbon cycles, and even volcanic events. Through these clues, scientists can trace the sequence of changes that led to the Devonians' long unravelling. It's a forensic investigation on a planetary scale. The more we learn, the clearer it becomes that extinction is never about a single cause. It is the sum of many small disruptions, a shift in temperature here, a drop in oxygen there, a loss of habitat, a change in chemistry, a slow imbalance between production and decay. Each factor alone might be survivable, but together they become a tide that no species can resist. The fossils record not just death, but accumulation. Among the fragments of bone and armour, there are also traces of resilience. Fossils of early sharks appear alongside those of dying placoderms, proof that some life persisted even at the height of the crisis. These early sharks were small, with simple teeth and flexible bodies, adapted to scavenging and ambush rather than domination. They were the heirs of a fading world, stepping cautiously into a new one. Their remains are often delicate, preserved only as impressions or tiny fragments of tooth. But they are there, consistent and steady, a quiet line threading through chaos. It's humbling to realise how much of our understanding of these ages comes from chance. Fossilization is a rare process, dependent on conditions that almost never align. Most creatures vanish without a trace. For every armoured fish that left a fossil, thousands more dissolved into nothing. The record we have is not complete. It's a series of glimpses, moments caught between erosion and preservation. The gaps are vast, the silence is long. But even in those silences there is meaning. Absence itself tells a story, the story of everything that time forgot. The discovery of these fossils also reminds us that Earth's history is never buried for long. Erosion exposes what sediment once concealed, revealing bones that haven't seen daylight in hundreds of millions of years. When paleontologists chip away at rock and uncover the ridged surface of a placoderm's plate or the curve of a shark's fin spine, they are literally reopening a moment in time. The air that touches those fossils is the first air to reach them since before forests existed, since before insects took flight, since before vertebrates walked on land. To stand before such a fossil is to confront scale, of time, of change, of impermanence. These bones do not speak of tragedy, they speak of process. They remind us that extinction is not failure but transformation, that every disappearance leaves behind the possibility of something new. The armoured fish did not vanish into nothing. They became part of the system that allowed sharks, bony fish, and eventually all vertebrates, including us, to exist. The fossils are not epitaphs, they are blueprints. Even now, the layers that hold these records continue to shift. Mountains rise, rivers carve, erosion reshapes the surface. The bones move again, lifted from the seafloor to the cliffs, from the cliffs to the hands of those who study them. Each discovery is another whisper from the vanished empire beneath our feet. The ocean of the Devonian is gone, but its history still breathes through stone. And if you were to hold one of those fossils, cool, dense, weighty, you might feel it faintly. The trace of movement, the memory of water pressing against armour, the vibration of a world before ours. It's not imagination. The rock truly does contain that memory. Every layer, every line, every mineral replacement is a translation of life into permanence. What once swam now endures in silence, but the silence speaks. The fossils are not merely remnants of creatures, they are remnants of systems, entire worlds compacted into form. Each bone is a fragment of an ecosystem that once thrived, the prey that fed it, the predators it feared, the currents it swam through. When scientists reconstruct a Devonian reef from fossils, they are not guessing, they are listening. The rocks tell them which species lived together, which layers of sediment carried oxygen, which parts of the seafloor were crowded or barren. In their patterns lies the rhythm of a vanished ocean. The age of the survivors had inherited that rhythm, but the fossils are what keep it alive for us. They are the only witnesses left from that vanished empire, and through them we can see not just what was lost, but what was learned. The armoured fish taught the world how to build protection, how to shape bone, how to use jaws as tools. The sharks taught it how to survive without excess, how to adapt through simplicity. Together, their fossils form the conversation that evolution never stopped having. Somewhere, deep in a quarry or along a riverbank, a geologist breaks open a slab of stone. The rock splits along an ancient line, and for the first time in hundreds of millions of years, a shape appears, a fragment of armour, the imprint of a fin. It is not discovery in the human sense, it is recognition. The Earth is reminding itself of its own story, and in that story, whispered through fossil and time, lies the memory of the first great monsters that ate sharks, and of the sharks that outlived them all. The empire is gone, but the whispers remain. And the sea, though changed beyond recognition, still carries the same pulse it did then. A quiet, endless motion, filled with the memory of what came before. If you stand on any shore today and listen long enough, you might think the ocean is empty of memory. It moves as it always has, a surface in motion, restless and impersonal. The waves rise and fall, the tide comes and goes, and the sound repeats until it feels like nothing at all. But beneath that steady rhythm lies a record older than language, older than continents, older even than bones. The ocean remembers everything that has ever lived within it. Every extinction, every survival, every small adaptation. It's all still there. Written not in sound, but in chemistry, temperature and motion. The water carries it all. The sea that rolls against our shores today is not the same one that filled the Devonian world, but it is connected to it without interruption. The molecules of water that pass through the gills of armoured fish still circulate somewhere within it. The salts that once filled those shallow reefs are the same salts that now mix through the deep currents. The minerals shed from the bones of giants are part of the sediments that shape coastlines and seafloors. The ocean never started over. It only changed shape. It's a single, continuous body of memory that has flowed unbroken for nearly 4 billion years. When you look across it, you're seeing the same mirror that reflected the first vertebrates, the same surface that once hid the shadows of predators that no longer exist. The forms have changed, but the pattern hasn't. The currents still move heat from the equator to the poles. The plankton still drift, feeding everything above them. The predators still patrol the boundaries of visibility, hunting by instinct older than trees. The ocean does not forget how to be alive. If it could speak, it would not tell stories the way we do. It would not describe beginnings and endings, only continuities. How one age dissolved into the next, how one extinction made room for another beginning, how the bodies of the fallen became nutrients for the survivors. It would describe time as an unbroken current, always moving, always folding the past into the present. To the ocean, the Devonian was yesterday. The sharks that swim through it now carry the memories in their flesh. Their design is not new. Their skeletons are still made of cartilage, light and strong. Their skin is still covered in tiny denticles, each one a remnant of the first protective scales their ancestors wore when the world was young. Their eyes are tuned to the same wavelengths of light that once filtered through Devonian waters, their sense of smell still capable of detecting the faintest traces of life across miles. Even their reproductive strategies, slow growth, few offspring, long gestation, are echoes of the ancient oceans where survival depended on precision. They are not relics, they are continuity made visible. Every movement a shark makes is part of a rhythm that began before mammals, before reptiles, before forests reached their full height. When it glides through the water, it follows the same flow its ancestors did when the first reefs collapsed and the giants died. It does not know that it carries those memories. It does not need to. Evolution has written them into its body. Its muscles remember what worked. Its senses remember what failed. Its survival is not thought. It is memory in motion. The ocean remembers more than just its creatures. It remembers its own transformations. In its depths are layers of temperature that mark the climate of every era. Warm water still holds traces of carbon dioxide released by volcanoes that erupted 500 million years ago. Cold currents carry the fingerprints of ice ages, locked in their salinity. The sediments of the seafloor preserve the record of every extinction, each layer a bookmark in the planet's long, slow autobiography. The deep-sea cores pulled up by research vessels are not just mud, they are chapters. They tell us when oxygen vanished, when coral returned, when continents shifted. They are the ocean's memory made tangible. It's strange to think that something so vast can also be so fragile. The same system that has endured every catastrophe is still dependent on balance. Temperature, chemistry, pressure, and life are woven together so tightly that a change in one echoes through all the others. The Devonian taught that lesson brutally. When oxygen fell, the giants died. When the reefs collapsed, the hunters starved. The same principles still govern the sea now. The ocean has learned to keep itself stable, but it can only adapt within limits. When scientists study the fossils of placoderms or the evolution of sharks, they are not just looking into the past, they are looking into the mechanics of memory. The traits that once saved the survivors are still the ones that matter. Flexibility, awareness, restraint. The creatures that endure are not the most aggressive or the most armoured, but the ones that move with the water instead of against it. That rule hasn't changed since the Devonian, and it probably never will. There's a kind of irony in the fact that we, the descendants of those survivors spend so much time trying to reconstruct what the ocean already knows. We take core samples, analyse isotopes, model currents, all to piece together a history that still exists in every wave. But that's how memory works when you're not the one who holds it. You have to learn it all over again. The ocean remembers easily because it never stops being itself. We, having left it behind, have to dig to find what it never forgot. The fossils tell us what the ocean endured, the chemistry tells us how it healed, and the life within it now tells us what it became. The reefs that grow today are descendants of those that died in the Devonian, rebuilt by corals that evolved to withstand temperature shifts and sediment stress. The fish that swim among them are the inheritors of two ancient lineages, the bony fish that rose after the collapse and the sharks that never left. Together they recreate in miniature the same structure of predator and prey, balance and competition that has existed since the first jaws closed over the first meal. The pattern persists because it works. It's the ocean's most enduring memory. Sometimes, when a deep-sea probe descends into the black water miles below the surface, the camera captures something that feels almost too familiar. A shape, gliding through the dark, sleek, muscular, unhurried. It might be a modern shark, or it might be something stranger, something primitive that has changed so little that time itself seems irrelevant to it. Species like the frilled shark or the goblin shark still carry features that date back hundreds of millions of years. Their bodies are not anachronisms, they are living documents, written in cartilage instead of ink. They remind us that the ocean's memory is not only geological but biological. Some memories breathe. If the ocean has a voice, it's in these creatures. They don't speak, but they demonstrate what survival means. They move through pressure that would crush most life, through temperatures near freezing, through darkness older than light. They are not from the past, but they carry it with them. When they feed, when they breed, when they navigate invisible currents with precision no human instrument can match, they reenact the same relationships that defined the first complex ecosystems. In them, the Devonian never ended. It simply adapted. To understand the ocean's memory is to accept that history is not a straight line but a loop. Every extinction becomes sediment, every sediment becomes stone, every stone erodes back into the water and the cycle begins again. The bones of the giants that ate sharks became the minerals that fed plankton, that fed the sharks' descendants. There is no separation between what was and what is. The ocean folds it all into itself, endlessly recycling form and function. To the sea, the difference between past and present is just a matter of depth. Even sound travels through that memory. The low-frequency vibrations that move through water today carry echoes of the same frequencies that once rippled through Devonian seas. Every whale song, every seismic tremor, every crashing wave contributes to a constant undercurrent of vibration that never truly stops. Some frequencies travel thousands of miles bouncing off the seafloor, refracting through thermal layers, circling the planet again and again. The ocean listens to itself, just as it has since the first drop condensed on the cooling Earth. It also remembers the atmosphere above it. Every gas exchange between air and water carries traces of the world's previous climates. The oxygen we breathe now once cycled through prehistoric seas thick with algae. The carbon dioxide we exhale will dissolve into today's currents, altering chemistry just as volcanic gases did in the Devonian. The process is the same, only the participants have changed. The ocean doesn't distinguish between natural and artificial, it only records cause and effect. Every shift in pH, every rise in temperature, every bloom and die-off adds another line to its record. And still, despite everything it has endured, asteroid impacts, ice ages, greenhouse periods, mass extinctions, the ocean persists. It changes, adapts, rebalances. Its memory is not static, it's active, always rewriting itself, always testing what can survive. Life, in turn, mirrors that process. It doesn't fight the ocean's change, it evolves with it. The Devonian survivors proved that lesson beyond question. Sharks became the living embodiment of it, flowing with the current of time rather than resisting it. There's a quiet humility in recognizing that the sea is older than everything we call history. Every ship that sails on it, every city that rises near it, every net that drags through it, all of it exists on the surface of something that has already outlived entire worlds. The ocean doesn't hold grudges. It doesn't need to. It waits, it adapts, it endures. The giants are gone, but their legacy has already dissolved into the next form, the next balance. The sharks that swim beneath the waves now are just the latest memory made flesh. If you were to dive deep enough, far below the reach of sunlight, you would enter the part of the ocean where time seems suspended. The pressure increases, the temperature drops, and life moves slowly, deliberately. Down there, change happens at a different pace. The creatures that live in these depths are old in both form and function, evolved to survive isolation and scarcity. Some of them, like the coelacanth, are true living fossils, species thought extinct for millions of years, rediscovered alive and unchanged. Their existence is proof that the ocean does not lose what it values, it simply hides it. The deeper you go, the more the distinction between past and present dissolves. The silt that coats the seabed contains microscopic remains of every era, blended into a single continuum. The Devonian is still there, mixed with the Carboniferous, the Permian, the Cretaceous. Time, in the ocean, is not linear. It's layered, overlapping, continuous. To touch the sea floor is to touch everything at once. The ocean that still remembers is not a metaphor. It's a fact of physics, chemistry and biology. It remembers through cycles of energy and matter, through feedback loops that carry the past forward in altered form. It remembers through the DNA of its creatures, through the carbon that circulates between water and air, through the bones that settle and the reefs that rise again. Every particle of it has been part of something living and will be again. When we study fossils, we're decoding one kind of memory. When we measure currents, we're tracing another. But when we look into the open water and see life moving through it, the flash of scales, the glide of a shark, the drift of plankton, we're seeing the ocean's living memory in motion. Every movement is both ancient and new, both repetition and reinvention. That's what survival really is, remembering just enough of the past to continue forward. The ocean is not sentimental about what it loses. It doesn't mourn the armoured fish, or the reefs that came before, or the worlds that rose and fell in its depths. But it never forgets them either. Their lessons are built into its fabric, their atoms still circulating in its currents. It is the closest thing Earth has to immortality, not in any mystical sense, but as a system that never stops transforming what was into what is. If you listen to the sea long enough, you start to hear its rhythm differently. What seems like repetition becomes continuity. What seems like silence becomes balance. Every wave that breaks on the shore is part of a conversation billions of years old. The ocean that still remembers is not telling us what it lost. It's showing us what remains. And somewhere beneath that vast moving surface, in the spaces where sunlight fades and pressure reigns, the descendants of those ancient sharks are still swimming, quiet, unhurried, unbroken. They don't know they're carrying the memory of a world that ended. They don't have to. The ocean remembers for them. It always has. The ocean endures, and everything that has lived within it eventually becomes part of its patience. What begins as movement ends as mineral. What once breathed becomes pattern. Time works slowly down there, invisible but relentless, pressing everything soft into permanence. The creatures that ruled, the ones that hid, the ones that survived, all of them are fed, in the end, into the same cycle. And if you look closely enough, you can almost see the shape of time itself moving through it. Not as destruction, but as digestion. That is how the ocean remembers. through the gentle, endless teeth of time. When people imagine extinction, they picture violence, fire from the sky, waves crashing, chaos. But most endings are quiet. They happen grain by grain, year by year, as the balance shifts and what once worked begins to fail. The Devonian didn't end in fire, it ended in breathless stillness. The ocean suffocated slowly, and the armoured giants faded, their weight too great for a changing world. The sharks, lighter and unburdened, swam onward. They didn't conquer, they continued. That is what time rewards, the ability to continue. Every age believes itself to be the centre of time, but time has no centre. It moves like a tide, carrying everything forward in layers. The fossils of the placoderms lie beneath the fossils of the first forests, which lie beneath the bones of reptiles, which lie beneath ours. Each layer presses softly against the next, not erasing but blending. The same pressure that created stone also created continuity. Time doesn't separate things, it binds them. The giants are not gone, they're simply distributed. The calcium in their armour became the limestone beneath our feet, the dust in the air, the mineral veins in mountains. They are everywhere now, dissolved into everything. To hold a fossil from that vanished sea is to hold a captured moment of that process, the instant before the ocean folded it back into itself. The fine ridges on a bone, the curve of a jaw, the faint impression of a fin, all are marks left by the slow conversation between life and geology. The creatures never knew they were being recorded. They lived, they fed, they died, and time did the rest. Each fossil is a transcript, written in patience instead of ink. The ocean did not choose what to remember. It simply remembered everything. If you could slow time enough to see it, you would watch every movement become sediment. A school of early fish passes, their fins stirring silt. A predator's body sinks, and the current lays a thin film of clay over it. Then another, and another, until the weight of millions of years compresses it into stone. When that stone rises again, carved by weather into cliffs or split by human hands, the pattern of that life remains. It is not preservation for nostalgia, it is transformation. That is how the ocean writes. The gentle teeth of time do not bite to wound, they shape, they polish. They break down what resists and leave behind what can last. Bone turns to rock, rock to dust, dust to mineral again, circulating through currents that carry it forward. Every particle has belonged to countless forms before, perhaps once part of a fish's jaw, then a coral skeleton, then a grain of sand. The sea keeps nothing separate for long. Even extinction, which seems like an ending, is only a rearrangement. It's easy to look back at the Devonian and see tragedy, but the ocean doesn't think in terms of loss. It only recalibrates. Each disappearance makes space for something else to exist. The armoured fish vanished, and their absence created a new kind of equilibrium. The sharks that survived became the backbone of future ecosystems. The reefs rebuilt themselves, the cycles resumed. The sea has never been nostalgic. It accepts, absorbs, and continues. The same patience governs everything we see now. The waves that erode a coastline, the coral that builds a reef, the plankton that drifts in endless rotation, all are expressions of the same slow intelligence that replaced the giants with something more enduring. Every creature alive today owes its existence to those invisible teeth, the slow breakdown that makes room for renewal. Time eats everything, but it does so gently enough that life can grow from what it leaves behind. If you stand by the shore at night and listen to the waves, you're hearing that same process scaled down to the rhythm of seconds instead of eons. The sand beneath your feet is made of former mountains. The shells that crunch under your shoes are future stone. The salt in the air was once inside something alive. Even the air you breathe has cycled through the ocean countless times, exchanged between wave and sky. Nothing truly leaves, it only changes form. The gentle teeth of time are everywhere in the sea. They grind coral into sand, sand into dust, dust into nutrient. They dissolve bones, polish shells, smooth stones. They take everything sharp and make it quiet. The ocean is not cruel, it's efficient. It knows that survival is not about resisting change, but surrendering to it. The creatures that last are those that understand this balance, even if they do not think of it in words. Sharks learned it first, and they have never forgotten. The Devonian sharks were small, uncertain things, built to dodge and endure. The ones that swim now are vast, precise, deliberate. They are time-made flesh, honed over hundreds of millions of years into the simplest expression of survival. Every glide, every turn, every beat of muscle is a lesson repeated through unbroken generations. They are not descendants of the giants. They are their inheritors. The placoderms taught the ocean how to dominate. The sharks taught it how to persist. Time polished one away and left the other sharp enough to last. We often imagine evolution as progress, a story moving upward toward perfection. But the fossils tell a different story. They show experimentation, failure, adjustment, and endurance. They show that the ocean never aims for improvement, it aims for continuity. What works stays, what doesn't disappears. The gentle teeth of time aren't sculptors, they're editors. They refine the story, removing excess until only the essential remains. The result is not simplicity, but precision. The modern ocean is the sum of everything time has tested and kept. Each wave carries the chemistry refined over billions of years. Each creature moves within boundaries set by ages of trial and collapse. The sharks, the whales, the plankton, all function because time has stripped away what doesn't endure. What remains is what the planet itself has approved. When paleontologists find the trace of a fin pressed into stone, or the outline of a shell in sediment, they are reading the footnotes of that long editing process. The lines and shapes in rock are not accidents. They are the punctuation marks of existence. Every fossil is a pause, a comma in a sentence that never ends. Even extinction is just a period, followed by a new clause. The sea keeps writing. Sometimes, in the layers of rock, there are gaps, intervals where almost nothing was preserved. They mark moments when conditions failed, when oxygen dropped too low, or sediment washed away too quickly. These silences are as important as the fossils themselves. They are the breaths between words, the moments when the ocean reset its rhythm. Time's teeth rest as often as they grind, but they never stop entirely. Even stillness is part of the work. The ocean today carries more of those silences than fossils. Most of what has lived will never be recorded. The creatures that die in the open sea sink into darkness where decay outpaces preservation. Their bodies are consumed by scavengers and bacteria until only molecules remain. But even those molecules continue on, circulating through currents, entering new lives, new systems. The sea never stops its recycling. Fossilization is only one kind of memory. The rest is movement. If the ocean could speak to us about time, it would not talk about loss. It would talk about exchange. It would remind us that everything living borrows its form from what came before and will return it when it's done. The gentle teeth of time are not punishment. They are participation. They make room for everything new by dissolving what is finished. The Devonian didn't die. It was digested into everything that followed. The reefs that stretch across the tropics now grow on limestone formed from the bodies of ancient corals, layered over reefs that came before them, all the way back to the ones that first rose in the warm Devonian shallows. Each generation grows on the compressed remains of its ancestors, feeding on the calcium they left behind. The process is endless, circular, indifferent, and beautiful. The ocean builds by erasing, and somewhere in that slow cycle between erosion and growth the story of sharks continues. They glide through the same chemical medium their ancestors did, through the same ratio of salt and water, under the same physics of light. Their world has changed, but the rules that sustain them have not. The Devonian taught them to move with the current, not against it, and time has confirmed that lesson in every era since. Their teeth, forever replaced throughout their lives, are miniature versions of time itself, always wearing down, always renewing, never gone. If you find one of those teeth washed ashore, sharp and grey from ages in the sand, you're holding a fragment of that cycle. It is not just a remnant of an animal, it is a piece of the planet's long metabolism, spat back to the surface for a moment before being swallowed again. Every wave that carries it has touched continents that no longer exist, reefs that have risen and fallen countless times. It is history you can hold, small enough to lose, vast enough to represent everything. Time does not stop at fossils. It keeps working until even memory becomes material. The cliffs that hold the Devonian bones will one day erode into beaches, and those beaches will become sediment again, and new life will rise on top of them. Each cycle is slower than the last, but the motion never ceases. The gentle teeth of time grind down everything solid until it becomes the foundation for something else. The sea is never empty. It is just between forms. The same rhythm that erased the giants and lifted the sharks still moves through every current. It's in the shape of the tides, the slow breathing of the planet. It's in the way the ocean takes everything sharp and turns it smooth. If time has a face, it is the surface of the sea, always changing, never ending. The gentle teeth of time have already begun their work on us too. The carbon in our bodies once belonged to fish, to coral, to plankton. The oxygen in our lungs was made by algae drifting in ancient sunlight. When we're gone, those same atoms will return to the cycle, carried again by water, folded again into new lives. We're not separate from the ocean's memory. We are one of its expressions. That is the quiet truth the sea has always known. Nothing is ever truly lost. Everything becomes part of what remains. The armoured fish, the first sharks, the vanished reefs, the forest that rose afterward, they're all still here, rearranged, rebalanced, waiting for the next transformation. The ocean's patience ensures that nothing is wasted, only changed. Time does not hurry. It doesn't need to. It has all the oceans to work with. The gentle teeth keep turning, polishing, erasing, building, never stopping. The sea, as always, moves forward, carrying its memories in silence, teaching everything that lives within it the same lesson it taught the sharks: endure, adapt, continue. And as the tide pulls away, the sound it leaves behind is not of ending but of repetition. The rhythm of time grinding softly against the edge of the world. The gentle teeth still working as they always have, shaping the next beginning.